Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2021 New England Conservation Finance Roundtable. This event is being recorded for future distribution. Good morning, Lee Welton. How are you this morning?
Take myself off mute. Good morning, Spencer. I'm caffeinated, ready to roll. Lots of friends and colleagues, new and old, joining us today.
Yeah, really glad to be here with you today. It was really fun to see 36 or so of us conservation finance friends last night at the meet and greet. Really glad to have so many people that took the time out of their evenings to join us. That was a good time. We had a few kids show up. We had some interesting stories people were telling from their trials and tribulations over the last year, and great to see some familiar and some new faces as well.
You're here.
All right, great. Well, let's get started. Just a quick reminder, this roundtable is being recorded. We will distribute the recording afterwards. And I'm going to get started. My name is Spencer Meyer. I'm with the Highstead Foundation, and I'm really pleased to be with all of you today. In this time of remote meetings and Zoom fatigue, I certainly understand it can be really challenging to get motivated to attend conferences. And we at Highstead and with Conservation Finance Network are really thrilled that so many of you reached out and engaged in this event today. Your presence here is really a testament to the urgency of the work we all do together in the region and beyond. And I'm really excited for the conversations that we're going to have and for the panelists today, and hope it really is the beginning of many new conversations with all of us together. First, I want to share just a bit about Highstead with you. We're a private operating foundation. We're based here in Connecticut, but we work all around New England and beyond with our partners. Many of you are here with us today as well. Our mission is to help create a healthier, more livable world for all by working with our partners to conserve the land that sustains us and to steward our natural spaces, resources, and communities thoughtfully and inclusively. We use the wildlands and woodlands, farmlands, and communities' vision for the future of New England as our guiding light, and our core programs encompass regional collaboration through the Regional Conservation Partnership Network, for example, our conservation policy and finance programs, ecological science and land stewardship, and all these programs are guided by our scientific underpinnings. In essence, we're here to serve all of you as you strive in your own missions of community conservation, land protection, climate mitigation and adaptation, healthy communities, equitable access to natural resource, and making our communities the thriving places we live and work. Before I introduce my co-host, I'd like to thank some special people. The spotlight today will be on our session leaders and our panelists, but of course, there are a number of people behind the scenes working hard to bring us all together. I want to thank our entire Highstead team for their guidance and partnership, and especially the following individuals who have made this all possible. Notably, Tara Whalen, Jody Kalogi, Jean Ammermuller, and Wen Nguyen from Green Meetings, who's working with us tirelessly to ensure our technical and Zoom support and all things run smoothly today. So thank you to that entire team. I think they're going to show up on the screen here in just a second so we can publicly thank them for how much they've been doing for us. Next, I want to thank all of our partners throughout the region who inspire us, especially all of you who participated in the series of webinars and that led to our annual Regional Conservation Partnership gathering in the fall, led by our own Bill Labick at Highstead. I also want to thank our session leaders, Hadley Curo, Kavita Kapoor-McLeod, and Sean Thackerdine for their partnership in developing these sessions together with us. And of course, I'd like to thank our panelists themselves, who you'll learn a lot more about later this morning. Some of them are coming to us from the Pacific time zone, very bright and early, and I want to thank them for that dedication. I also want to thank our 24 unsung conservation finance heroes who have volunteered to facilitate the small group conversations later in the program. When you meet them in the breakout rooms, you'll know who they are, and they have a lot of wisdom to share with all of us as well. My final thank you goes to my friend and co-host Lee Welton here, the director of the Conservation Finance Network. Lee and her team have been steadfast partners over the years as they lead so many field building programs and opportunities for all of us. This New England Roundtable is really an extension of Lee's national series of roundtables, and I'm really thrilled to have Lee here with me today.
Thank you, Spencer. And to avoid blushing, I'm going to toss that generous thank you right back at Spencer and the team. Highstead really carried the water on today's program and did an incredible job engaging all of you in this convening. We often describe the conservation finance community as one of diffuse reciprocity, and I think that's absolutely the ethos that Spencer, Tara, Jody, and the Highstead team provide to all of our benefit. So thanks, Spencer. I'm Lee Welpton, the director of the Conservation Finance Network. Our fundamental business is to expand people's capacity, connections, and confidence to execute on conservation finance. We aim to bridge sectors. We aim to help people find the capital they need to advance the pace and scale of their own efforts. And the power of being a network has taken some reflection and some learning over the years on my end for sure. But I do think that that power boils down to the ability, our ability to bring practitioners together beyond individual mission statements, beyond individual investment strategies, beyond, organizational mandates, to align energy and innovation on what matters most for the context of today in New England. The network is currently going through an evolution. We're transitioning out on our own. The work ahead for us is to offer deeper deal support and technical guidance to help land and resource conservation NGOs and community stakeholders increase their collaboration with private capital partners. I'm joined in that work and want to share a word of gratitude to my colleague Jackson Mueller, CFN's chief instigator and project coach, and to our co-founders and members of the advisory committee, to the many partners, colleagues, and friends who are joining us today. Just a sincere thank you. As Spencer and I were reflecting on what is represented by today's convening, it's this very fascinating opportunity to bridge networks for the first time. So all of you represent the RCP network, represent the Wildlands and Woodlands audience. We have a number of conservation finance bootcamp alumni from all across New England joining us. We're joined by stakeholders from a national conservation finance roundtable that CFN has operated with deep collaboration and partnerships for the past 5+ years. We want to acknowledge as well the leadership and partnership of the Center for Business and the Environment at Yale, which hosted the boot camps for the first decade or so, and with whom we've co-created a platform which captures and disseminates actionable information on all things conservation finance, together with deep collaboration and partnership from Highstead too. So this confluence of individuals and institutions represents a veritable network of networks coming together for the very first time, at least all together for the first time. And spoiler alert, we really hope that the connections that we see today are going to continue far beyond into the future in 1,000 points of light. So we hope you'll join us to help kickstart an ongoing discussion about what backbone support looks like for conservation finance collaborations across New England. Spencer, back to you.
Great, Lee. Thanks for those words. And we're going to talk a lot more about those collaborations and what they could look like at the closing session today. But let's take a quick pause and put up a poll just to get a sense of what kinds of organizations are represented here today. You should have a poll that popped up on your screen. You can click on the answer that you represent. We'll just give it 10 or 15 more seconds and see who's represented, and then we'll move on. Yeah, great. Well, while that poll is finishing up, let me say a little bit more about the purpose of today's roundtable. And when that poll closes in just a moment, we'll pause and reflect on it. For so long, environmental and social challenges have largely been siloed, not just in our region, but more broadly than that. And as we think about preparing for this event, it becomes clear that in order to solve our most pressing conservation challenges, we really need to reach beyond our traditional conservation community and help solve some other problems as well. Our speakers today are going to highlight some really exciting ways that this is already happening, some that are in the incubation phase, some that are already tested. And we're going to get some ideas from them about how to scale and replicate some of these groundbreaking approaches to integrating conservation with other issues. I think you'll find one common thread within these case studies is that they each really require multi-solving for specific and pressing environmental and social needs that they're addressing within their regions and communities. And so we'll see this kind of integrated approach is only possible if you seek unusual partners and complementary missions. And I think all the panels are really going to highlight that notion. So in some ways, bringing together the conservation community with the finance community has been scary in this community of practice. Both fields have troubling roots of inequitable distributions of resources that we acknowledge, and we're all learning to grapple with that. But our theory of change today is that at their best together, conservation and finance will merge and align public and private resources that can increase the equitable distribution of the benefits themselves that come from the land conservation stewardship work that we do. The clean air and the clean water and the public health and the access and all those things that need to accrue to all of our community members. So in essence, we need to evolve as a community of conservationists because the environmental, social, and economic triple bottom line is really the only bottom line that matters in the long run. And that's what we're here to talk about today. Let's just end the polling here. And what we see is that we're predominantly represented by land trust and other NGOs. It's great that we have several funders here today, some of whom are going to be speaking on panels, but we have others waiting in the wings in the roundtable, and public agencies and academic thought leaders. And 10% of us are from the private sector, and that's really a category we hope this work will increase over time as we have more and more business partnerships and other private sector entities. So thank you all for being here today. All right, so the purpose of the event is threefold. First, we want to let the leaders of these innovative partnerships share their stories that will inspire all of us to do more better. We want to stimulate a conversation in the region about how this kind of collaboration on integrated projects can really have outsized impacts beyond what any one of these groups can do on their own. And we want to showcase these non-traditional partnerships, how that helps conservation groups better align themselves with the broader issues that communities are facing beyond simply the conservation needs. So we want to strengthen the existing and certainly form new relationships between the idea makers and the funders and the movers and shakers who together are addressing these land and water challenges. Our hope is that this will lead to more regular dialogue for regional collaborations, and Lee and I will talk a lot more about that in the closing session with a lot of help from all of you. So I'm going to turn it back to Lee for a few more thoughts on today's program.
Thanks, Spencer. And I'm really just going to build on what you already shared. We together wanted to start this meeting with an acknowledgement and also a question. Together with our stakeholders and communities, we need a more holistic, equitable practice of conservation, finance, and philanthropy. Land and resource conservation includes buying and selling land, which draws on historic and present day patterns of land ownership and the accumulation of wealth. As a community, we need to continue to acknowledge how laws, regulations, government programs, enforcement, and policies have been racist and unequal for environmental quality, environmental protection, open space access, and our broader financial systems and institutions. For better or worse, our work is done in a capitalist society. And a lot of the systems and tools, tax benefits, for example, themselves are not equitable systems. So we just wanted to acknowledge starting out today that this is where we collectively are. We hope that conservation finance can offer a set of strategies and approaches to help address harm and help the benefits of conservation accrue more equitably. This is on our minds as we move forward in engaging conservations and in ongoing conversations and collaborations. This is the framing that we're going to bring.
Great, thank you, Lee. One of our team members is going to put up a link to the agenda right there in the chat, and so you can follow along. We want to get right into the content as soon as possible, but there's just a few housekeeping items. First is that throughout the day, there's going to be a few polls like the one you just did. There's also going to be an opportunity to fill out some more substantive comments that you might have in a Google form, which the link of which will show up in the chat box, and you'll just click on that and it'll take you to your own private form page where you can put in your thoughts that won't be shared with others, but which we'll use throughout the day and going forward to sort of develop some of our programming. So use the chat function. Don't use the Q&A if you do see that on your Zoom console. A reminder that this session is being recorded and that we're going to do our best to keep our panels on time. And so I encourage you, if you need to step away for a minute, to pay close attention to that agenda that should be linked any minute now. And I want to just, quickly introduce our three panelists, and I'm going to turn it over, the moderators, and then turn it over to the first one. First, we have Hadley Curo, who's the conservation coordinator for the Sebago Clean Waters Initiative in Maine. Hadley's a close collaborator, and you're going to see she has a lot of great things to say about how that partnership will dovetail with some of the others we're going to hear about from our full panelists. So I'm really excited to have Hadley join us today. Kavita Kapoor McLeod, who's a principal at KKM Environmental Consulting, is going to lead our Natural Climate Solutions panel and has been doing a lot of her own work in the last year on this topic, and will really be able to bring out a lot of the key concepts among those panelists. And finally, Sean Thackerdine, a program associate at Doris Duke Conservation Foundation, is going to lead the Healthy People and Communities panel. And Sean was really instrumental in being a thought partner with us for developing that panel and helping choose some of the panelists who have really unique stories to tell. So we're really grateful to Hadley, Kavita, and Sean, and excited to hear them lead these panels. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Hadley to begin our water finance first panel.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Spencer and Lee, for your welcome to the roundtable today. As Spencer said, my name is Hadley Curo. I work for two land trusts in Western Maine as the conservation coordinator for Sebago Clean Waters. I'm delighted to start us off today with a conversation on clean water investments and how innovative partnerships are expanding the ways in which conservation works. As someone who is familiar with the workings of land and water conservation on the ground and in the waterways, I'm eager to learn with all of you about different financing options for water protection and the people and entities with whom we can pursue them. With us today for this conversation is David Kane, the Executive Director of Administration for the Portland Water District in Maine, Celia Rischel, Project Developer with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, and Ashley Allen Jones, Founder and CEO of I2 Capital. It's exciting to bring representatives of a water utility, state agency, and impact investing together to talk about how their work leads into conservation. The non-traditional partnerships, developing policy, and creative financing our panelists will speak of today model just a few of the continuously burgeoning relationships and opportunities to translate the idea that conservation is everyone's business into practical application. So we'll start our conversation today with a quick poll that you should see on your screen shortly. We'll give everyone a moment to respond and then share the results. I think that should be coming. Maybe there's a poll coming.
It's there, Hadley. Folks are answering. We've got about 90 so people that have already responded.
Oh, sorry, I guess I haven't seen it on my screen then. So great.
No worries.
I'm glad people are responding.
Hopefully when it ends, you'll see the results, but it looks like about 40% are already doing it, 24% eager to try, 35% we're not sure how to get started, and just 1% that says we don't like clean water. So we'll just give it a couple more seconds here and I will end the poll, but thanks folks for filling it out.
Well, for that 1%, we're excited to have you here. Hopefully your full answer will change.
Okay, I just did the share results here. Do you see the results on your screen? I
don't, but it sounds like you gave a good summary.
Okay, great. So it looks like 39% already doing it. So that's a really good response right there. So I'll stop sharing that and let you take it away.
Wonderful. So thank you everyone, including that 1%, for submitting your responses. And now let's hear from our speakers who will share about their work. And speakers, if you could also share from where you're calling in, that'd be lovely to ground us in, earth dwellings instead of just the Zoom world. And David, we'll start with you.
David, you might be on mute if you want to unmute yourself.
Oh, you missed my introduction. I'm sorry.
There you are.
Thank you and good morning, everybody. I learned the technology someday. So, yeah, I'm up here in Portland, Maine. I'm pleased to be here today to provide an introduction to the Portland Water District Watershed Land Conservation Program. And before jumping into the program introduction, I'll give you a little background of Portland Water District. No, we are a quasi-municipal entity. We're overseen by 11 publicly elected officials. We provide water and wastewater services and have provided drinking water since 1908. Currently, we serve about 210,000 customers in the greater Portland area. Water is drawn from Sebago Lake, which is about 25 miles from downtown Portland, and it's delivered to our service territory over 1,000 miles of pipe. Sebago Lake is the second largest lake with the second largest main lake with 1 trillion gallons of water. The water quality is exceptionally good due to the size and depth of the lake and the fact that the watershed is mostly forested. Portland Water District draws its water from an intake in the southern end of the lake, where we have a 2-mile no trespassing zone. This zone comprises about 10% of the lake. The rest of the lake is used for recreation, with many homes and cottages along the shore. Being a multi-use lake, having a good watershed protection program is especially important. We currently spend about $1 million a year monitoring activities around the lake, permitting septic systems and expecting development around the lake, educating the public and school children, and a land conservation program. Historically, before the year 2000, a long time ago, the focus of the conservation program was on land near or around the 2-mile limit. In 2000, the focus began to shift to the larger watershed area further away from our intake. And why did that shift happen? One of the primary drivers was a change in federal regulation. In the 1990s, a new federal regulation mandated water utilities to filter their water to prevent potential waterborne disease outbreaks that occurred in some communities across the country because of inadequate treatment. For Portland Water District, that would mean constructing a $150 million filtration plant, which is estimated to increase our water rates by 80%. Instead, we decided to ask for a waiver, noting the exceptional water quality and a commitment to have a strong watershed protection program. This commitment to a strong program eventually included efforts to conserve forested land throughout the watershed. The watershed area is about 235,000 acres and is currently 84% forested. And the forest acts as a natural filtration plant, protecting the lake's water quality. Some studies have indicated the forest cover in a watershed dipping below or around 70% or so, the lake begins to show a significant decline in water quality. That concern is now driving us to invest more into the watershed land protection. If we go to this next slide, you can see the evolution of the watershed protection land program going back to 2000 through 2025. And we hope by 2025 to have 16,000 additional acres of land, forest land protected from development. The first deals in early 2000 were an outgrowth of our education efforts with the community and resulted in requests for assistance, including small financial contributions. The first one was to help conserve some land around a small pond. We contributed $10,000. The small donations came out of the Watershed Protection General Operating Fund. This began the process of PWD becoming known in the conservation community to be interested in such projects and are willing to assist with financial assistance. And that started to generate more and more interest from others who are looking to preserve land for various reasons. As the interest grew and the more and more requests came in, our board started asking questions of why are we even doing this? The board wrestled with it for a little bit and ultimately approved policy in 2007 to support the effort. The policy states that the district would support measures to preserve Sebago Lake watershed land and to provide open space for lake-friendly public access. And the district will cooperate and partner with organizations and individuals who seek to conserve and manage their watershed land in a manner that protects water quality and therefore protects the health of the drinking water consumer. In 2009, the board created funding for the program and other related watershed protection efforts by dedicating the net proceeds of any sale of excess water property. Life to date, that has generated about $1.2 million for those efforts. In 2012, the interest continued to grow. A more formal process had to be developed to evaluate the project in a standard for how much the district would contribute to those projects. The 2007 policy was amended, allowing a contribution between 0 and 25% of the estimated conservation value, with the amount based on the impact the land conservation would have on protecting the water quality. Other organizations took note and offered to help. To broaden the outreach effort and develop additional support, the coalition was formed and adopted the name Sebago Clean Waters. Sebago Clean Waters is a 9-partner organization which now functions in 4 working groups with distinct responsibilities: communication, land trust capacity building, mapping land, and the 4th one is fundraising. They created a long-term goal of conserving an additional 35,000 acres in 15 years. To support the effort, the group applied and was awarded a grant of $350,000 from the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Community. During this year, during that time frame, we issued our first bond related to purchasing conservation easement. Those went through the state revolving loan fund. We got a very good rate and some principal forgiveness. And we also got an $8 million grant from Regional Conservation Program. This last slide shows the number of partners that we are working on the effort. And it's truly an amazing story. If you go back 20 years ago, it started with an informal discussion between a land trust and a PWD staff person, and has grown now to a coalition of organizations and people working toward a common goal. And one of the reasons for the success is the tireless effort and vision of Paul Hunt, the district manager, who has worked many hours to make it happen, and Laurel Jackson, his co-worker, who takes care of all the details. And they have done a real good job. They've got a conservative, penny pinching guy, accountant like me, excited to spend millions of dollars, and have convinced me that my favorite hat is the Sebago Clean Water hat. So with that, I thank you for taking the time to listen to our story.
Great. Thank you, David, so much for sharing the story of Portland Water District's involvement in Sebago Clean Waters and how a water utility gets enamored with conservation. We're glad that's your favorite hat. Next, we'll hear from Celia Rischel from the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And you can actually just go right to the first slide there. So the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Fund, which I'll call the CWSRF or SRF, is a revolving fund administered at the state level under the authority of the Federal Clean Water Act. EPA manages it, and every state has an SRF. The CWSRF provides low-cost financing to make improvements to wastewater, that's sewage, and stormwater infrastructure, as well as natural infrastructure, including land conservation. Fund balances are maintained through the annual infusion of federal and state capital, as well as loan repayments. Now, we have 3 basic tools for making SRFs lower cost than traditional financing. That's below market interest rates and administrative fees, extended loan terms, and principal forgiveness, which we call additional subsidy. CWSRF eligibilities in Vermont were initially limited to sewage and stormwater, that is public treatment works projects, that is things with pipes and pumps and concrete that address point sources of pollution. And only government entities were eligible to borrow for that. What we were able to do today required statute change at both the federal and the state levels. While there was some prior support for non-point source pollution projects, it was tied to soil-based decentralized wastewater systems. CWSRF became a potentially significant source of conservation funding with the passage in 2014 of the Federal Water Resources Reform and Development Act, or WRDA. And it really made substantial changes to the Clean Water Act, including an expansion of eligible project types. New project types included land conservation, as well as wetland and floodplain restoration, woody buffer planting, dam removal, erosion repair. And we call these project types natural infrastructure. But WRDA alone wasn't enough. State statute here in Vermont also restricted eligible uses, borrowers, and loan terms. Things opened up in 2018 with the passage of Vermont Act 185, which was made possible really because 3 things aligned, or 3 things coincided. The first was the release of the Lake Champlain phosphorus TMDL. In that case, that's the total maximum daily load. That's the maximum amount of a pollutant that a body of water can receive while still meeting Clean Water Act water quality standards. The second was Vermont CWSRF's large outstanding loan balance. And the third was really insufficient state funds to meet those DMDL needs. Now, it's worth mentioning that only about 4% of phosphorus pollution in Lake Champlain actually comes from wastewater treatment facilities. The rest comes from non-point sources like agriculture and forestry, roads, and urban areas. It was suddenly clear, or it was made clear by the tireless Teresa Thomas in my department in countless legislative hearings, that if we were going to make progress on the TMDL, CWSRF had to be expanded to address the real sources of the problem. Now, the interesting thing to note here is that while phosphorus really was the wedge that opened up CWSRF to natural infrastructure projects, our eligibilities are not actually tied to phosphorus reductions. Phosphorus is important, but so are many other things, and modeling and measuring phosphorus is a huge administrative burden that we do not have to take on. The test for eligibility under the SRF is simply that it provide water quality benefits. So we have two primary mechanisms through which to fund natural infrastructure projects: sponsorship and interim financing. So based on our experience so far, we sometimes think of these as slow money and fast money. That is, sponsorship being somewhat slow money and fast money being interim financing. And if you could go to the slide before this. So municipalities and private nonprofits are eligible for both of these. And they both encourage local collaboration and leverage the expertise of existing groups, both inside the Department of Environmental Conservation and externally. This collaborative structure is a source of strength, but it can also present some challenges. So this next slide here. Okay, great. So sponsorship was pioneered by states like Iowa and Ohio. Our program, which we call the Water Infrastructure Sponsorship Program, or WISPR, is really still in its infancy. The basic structure is sponsorship is that it pairs a traditional treatment works project or sponsor with a natural infrastructure project, which we call the sponsored project or WISPR project. The WISPR project loan is then combined with the traditional treatment works loan upon completion of construction, regardless of whether the municipality itself or a nonprofit actually does the WISPR project. And the WISPR project is forgiven effectively via a reduced administrative fee on the combined municipal loan, plus an additional fee reduction, basically to incentivize participation. And so this slide is an example using a $3 million traditional project sponsoring a $300,000 natural infrastructure project. And the outcome is that sponsorship reduces the annual payments and the total debt for the municipality. We like to think of sponsorship as a way to bring funds to projects that otherwise wouldn't get funded. After all, a wetland doesn't generate revenue to pay back a loan. And it certainly encourages public and private partnerships. It provides upstream water quality benefits that can often be lower cost than engineered solutions. And by providing forgiveness through fee reduction, it preserves our limited additional subsidy, which is, again, that loan forgiveness. Now you can change the slide again.
And Celia, just a note, you've got about another minute to finish your story. Thank you.
Okay, great. So the second tool for natural infrastructure projects is interim financing. In this case, we mean a bit of a longer term than the typical bridge loan. It's a 5-year term with a repayment starting 1 year from execution. Payments are depressed for the first 4 years with a balloon payment at the end. So far, the interim financing has really been driven by nonprofits, and we've really only done land conservation projects to date. And the value has been to provide low-cost capital over a longer period of time than typical short-term borrowing, allowing borrowers some breathing room to complete other fundraising, do restoration work, and otherwise prepare for the final disposition of the land without tying up internal funds. And I don't quote me on this, but I think we've done about 11,000 acres right now. In 2019, we offered some loan forgiveness for interim financing tied to special water quality areas, but this was a little bit of a learning exercise for us. And it was a little complicated. So that's kind of given us direction for the future on how we might clarify forgiveness criteria. The last piece I'll mention, though, is a new spin on interim financing is the Farmland Futures Fund initiative, which uses interim financing as a revolving pass-through to the Vermont Land Trust to fund their initiative over the next 10 years with up to $10 million. Through the initiative, Vermont Land Trust purchases farmland, implements water quality improvements and ecological restoration, and then resells the property rather, subject to a conservation easement to a farmer trained and committed to adopting more sustainable and diversified agricultural practices. It's a partnership that gives us efficiency through working with a high-performing organization with a long track record of success. And Vermont Land Trust gains a stable, long, below market rates that really enables them to minimize their borrowing costs and realize their vision for these properties, restoring and transitioning to a new farmer who can be successful in sustainable agriculture. And I'll leave it right there.
Thank you very much, Delia, for starting to share a little bit about the state revolving funds that are available. And last, we'll hear from Ashley Allen Jones of I2 Capital.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley. It's really great to be here. I am actually calling in this morning from Wyoming, where we work on some really interesting conservation work, but I2 Capital is based in Washington, DC, and we're focused right now in the mid-Atlantic on water conservation in both the Delaware River watershed and the Chesapeake watershed. So I know we have a short window here to speak, so I'm gonna just highlight some big ideas on 3 slides, and please, anyone who wants more detail on this work, please feel free to follow up with me directly. I'll leave my email on the last slide, I believe. So a couple points that I just want to highlight from earlier discussions on this call. The ecosystem in which conservation is happening across the country is, the ecosystems are quite varied, as I'm sure many of you know, but what Spencer really highlighted and what exists in Wyoming actually is a quite pristine ecosystem, and there's an enormous amount of focus on trying to protect that ecosystem before it's degraded. And in the Chesapeake and the Delaware River watersheds, we have a pretty different situation where there is a lot of development that has happened, significant tide of development that has happened over many, many years. And this thump of development is ongoing against this pressure of conservation. And what we're really trying to do, as Spencer alluded to, is integrate those two really powerful forces, with the development force being more powerful than the conservation force, but trying to integrate those two forces in a way where we can actually coexist and have development that is smart development, and have land conservation and land management that works for long-term sustainability. So the watershed that we're working in Delaware and Pennsylvania is called the Brandywine Christina, and it's a really interesting watershed because it has these three. It has urban, suburban, and rural, and it happens to have really high levels of pollutants in the rivers that are largely derived from agricultural runoff. And so another point I wanted to underscore is that when you talk about conservation finance, and when I, as a private sector investor, think about investment, what that term means to me is that there's a return on that money. So that's not what I've discovered. That's not what investment means to everyone, but that's what it means to the private sector and people that are talking with a private sector lens about investing money. So what we're trying to do is find the intersect between where we can put money in and where there are correlated forces that allow us to then, at a minimum, return that money back in a revolving way, and at a maximum, make some amount of margin on that money. And what that usually requires is pretty strong, clear regulatory parameters. And so in this watershed, we have regulatory parameters under EPA that are called MS4, Municipal Separate Stormwater Sewer System Obligations, and we're working within the context of MS4 obligations to create clean water. So I spent the most time on this slide just so that everyone understood that we have a regulatory driver here that is allowing us to do some innovative things around water quality conservation. So let's go to the next slide. So what we've done is put together what is in effect an environmental markets sort of business model that puts conservation on the ground through agricultural best management practices. It quantifies the amount of pollutants reduced from those conservation practices, and then it enters into contracts with municipalities that are required to reduce their pollutant loads under these Clean Water Act requirements, MS4 requirements. And so we're really just creating a distribution scheme where we transfer, scheme isn't necessarily the best word, an elegant distribution process where we transfer the value of conservation to a municipal entity that is interested in acquiring that value in order to achieve its compliance obligations. So next slide. To the point that Spencer and Lee and others made earlier, this elegant distribution scheme has involved a whole lot of people and a whole lot of work over several years. So private sector, nonprofit sector, legal, quantification, water science, conservation organizations on both the land trust as well as more scientific operating basis, working really closely with regulators and also working with municipal leaders that are like David, managing water resources for municipalities. And it's been a really exciting intersect of all of these people in a way that has allowed us to drive a really, really quite creative solution. Next slide. And so just in closing, we've created a pretty interesting capital structure for this work. The left-hand side shows the development capital, which was a combination of I2 capital, which we weren't necessarily seeking a return on, but we were putting at risk in order to develop this project. We combined that with NRCS capital, with some significant capital from the Nature Conservancy and the William Penn Foundation. And then also we had a couple of corporate sponsors, DuPont being the main corporate sponsor. The 3 municipalities that we've negotiated contracts with are Newark, the city of Newark in Delaware, and then the townships of Kennett and East Marlboro in Pennsylvania. And so we've got 3 pilot contracts that have been executed that are before the regulators. And the long-term capital structure, this is where I'm really excited, is we've actually created a nonprofit entity, but it's meant to be a blended finance entity that has some philanthropic backing that allows it to function efficiently. But then we will be using program-related investment grants, perhaps SRF financing, to layer debt in on top of grants and have that in an integrated capital structure that allows us to revolve this conservation capital in a way that we hope will be really sustainable and expansive. So I'll stop there. I'll put my email in the chain for anyone that wants to follow up. Thank you, Hadley.
Thank you very much, Ashley, for starting to explain your project and your work with us. It's really exciting. And now I think we have some time to have a conversation with our panelists about these 3 different or 3 interrelated approaches, really. So I think the rest of our panelists will join us soon on the screen. And just while this is coming together, I just want to clarify, I know this was important for me as I was starting to learn about these projects. We have a state revolving fund that is a loan fund from which entities can borrow and with an option of potentially partnering to reduce interest rates. That is capitalized by state and federal funds. And then we have a revolving water fund, which is privately capitalized and uses outcome-based metrics to sell to downstream users to regenerate funds. If something in that did not sound accurate, please flag me. But with that, I think we'll kind of start at the beginning, which is how can conservation, I'd love to ask all of you, how can conservation organizations or agencies align themselves with partners like you, like with the state or private investing or water utilities, to start kind of having these creative partnerships How can they align themselves, and what questions might they be asking themselves? I'll offer it to anyone to start.
Can jump in. This is David. I mean, I think some of the questions that people want to do is understand, what's driving the utility for why they want to protect the land. So there might be different reasons. For us, it was a filtration plant. There are sometimes other reasons. And the important question for us was, what type of oversight do we need to have, the utility needs to have on the conservation easements? Does the land trust or the people want us to be active managers of the of overseeing it or not? It was also important the legal structure of the conservation easement. For financial reasons, sometimes the utility, if they want to borrow money, they need to have an ownership interest in it. So that understanding what type of arrangements you need there. And I know up here in Maine, the administrator of the SRF program, they require a mortgage on the property for the life of the bond. If we got an SRF bond plus 40 years, which isn't something that we really wanted to do, but we're looking to change that.
Great.
And then the final thing is to ask about can the utility even do it? They got to make sure. There were the questions at the beginning of whether our charter even allowed us to participate in this type of activity. So.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. What is even possible? And I know, Celia and Ashley, that kind of comes into looking at how this starts, like what kind of policy structures need to be in place. I don't know if that fits into your answer, but maybe Celia, you want to speak to that?
Or I mean, the SRFs, at least they exist under a layer of both federal and state statute. And so even where there's the legislation on the federal level that allows these types of projects to happen, at least in our case, and this may be true for other states, we needed statute change at the state level as well to be able to start doing these projects. Now that we have that in place, though, what's limiting us is really just the ability of us and our partners to start generating projects and putting them together.
Great, thank you. And I don't know, Ashley, if you want to speak to how I think private investing might be the biggest jump for a lot of conservation organizations. How could they start approaching this kind of partnership?
It's a really great question. And my overall conclusion is that this work is happening where really entrepreneurial people like David and Celia and others that are in watersheds are sort of getting ahead of existing constructs and saying, how can we come together and create something that moves beyond where we are? So I don't think there's an existing blueprint. Or no, I know there's not an existing blueprint, right? That says, oh, go to this person or go to that person. But if you have, I think David's position, well, both David and Celia if you have an EPA state revolving fund team that is looking innovatively at ways to expand, get their funding capacity out into new areas, or you have a water utility that's looking at how it can better align itself with the land trust community or the nonprofit community, that's a really that's an attractive opening. And I do think that, we've been able to, we being I2 Capital and the revolving water fund, because we came in and put a stake in the ground, we've been able to be a really interesting intermediator of a lot of different forces that wouldn't necessarily, it's sort of like they talk at roundtables, but they wouldn't necessarily have come together around a business problem. But I think the challenge of that is that there's not, we're still building out the business cases, right? We're still trying to find out whether we, not if we can make a profit, if we can even create, create some sort of revolving fund. So this is still the Wild West or the Wild Northeast.
It can all be wild. And I know I appreciate you saying that this is new, and what I'm hearing all of you say kind of underneath this is that there's an element of just be creative and be bold and ask questions. And we heard in David's presentation, this started when one land trust was like, why don't we ask the water utility? Why don't we go to the state? Why don't we find an investor? But you three being at least a couple steps down this uncharted path in the Wild East, is what have you seen as possible pitfalls or potential challenges that you have stumbled across that might be valuable for conservation organizations or funders or agencies to learn from you, things to be kind of be aware of?
I'd love to jump in on that. Can we go in reverse order? And I love talking in this environment, this ecosystem of people. I think there is my perspective. This is a private finance perspective, right? But I'll just put it on the table. I think there's a lot of anxiety from the traditional conservation community around new mechanisms of funding that require quantification and contracts and markets and like, what does this all mean? And I think that's a really natural, and how does it all fit together? And, I think that we all, from my perspective, we're taking significant risk and sweat, rolling up our sleeves and trying to figure this out. And I think that, in particular, some of the land trust communities, and I don't even know the specific ones that are on this call, so I'm not pointing at anyone specifically, but I think that there is an anxiety that like don't change the way we do things, and I just think that our goal is to expand the pie for conservation, and we can only expand the pie for conservation by tapping new resources that require new levers. So that's my answer. I challenge everyone
Great.
to not be afraid.
Wonderful. Celia or Dave, do you have thoughts on challenges?
I can certainly share some of the challenges that we've encountered, and I'll echo what Ashley said, that the inertia is in not changing practice, as existing practice, and so part of it has been simply overcoming that, and that's both internally and externally. On the internal side, just starting to fund programs that are non-traditional requires a lot of time, and this has been and continues to be an ongoing struggle with us to try to develop new processes and new procedures, revisiting statute and rules and new protocols. Like, all of this has been a huge time investment, and that we've really struggled with that. And another piece is really that we still need to make the case to municipalities that natural resources projects have value and can provide equal or greater benefit than the traditional pipes and pumps project. And it's not helped by the fact that in Vermont, many communities are very small. Like, we only have 7 communities that even have populations over 10,000 people. So small communities, they don't have a lot of capacity, and they rely heavily on engineering firms, that is civil engineering firms, to advise them on operations and capital improvements. And it's just not in their sphere or world to think we can solve this problem with a natural project rather than putting pipes over here and moving concrete over there. So framing the issue continues to be a challenge for us. And another piece that's been challenging, which is sort of related, is developing these new partnerships. Like, we have established relationships with DPWs, with town administrators that are used to the conversation of built infrastructure. We don't have established relationships with the conservation community, and the conservation community isn't used to talking to DPW. And those relationships need to be established, and trust needs to be developed so that when the DPW director says, I have a CSO project, they can talk to a land trust, and they can trust that land trust to give them the information and make it simple and easy for them to say yes. And the last two pieces I'll just mention are that timing has been a serious issue. With sponsorship in particular, the timing has to line up with construction projects. And that means we need a long pipeline. And we can't be the ones putting projects together 3 years in advance. We need the conservation community to do that.
Yeah, thank you. So there's this about starting to build relationships you hadn't thought of, and a knowledge of what's coming down the line. And David, briefly, if you have any thoughts about struggles that the water district has had. I mean, you're kind of that example that Celia was mentioning.
I'm sorry, example on what? I'm sorry?
is an example of a challenge that the water utility has faced its relationship with organizations?
Well, I mean, I was going to carry on a little bit of the conversation that we just had a little bit. The utilities, public utilities especially, tend to be very conservative organization, slow to changing, and they aren't necessarily very political type of organization. So conserving land can be a very unpopular decision in some areas about conserving land, reducing growth potential and whatnot. So you have to think about that a lot. And I think that's one of the good reasons when we created the Sebago Clean Water effort, which with an outreach to the community, it now has like 9 or 10 businesses that are helping promote. They got this nice little logo, if you can see that on my hat. And they do public relation effort, trying to get the support from the general population. So it's a similar challenge that we've already talked about a little bit.
Great. Thank you all for sharing some of those potential roadblocks. I think the more we know kind of in advance, the more we can prepare as we're being bold and creative. I want to just hear a couple questions or share some questions from the audience at this time. There's quite a few. I think you three are all inspiring new thoughts, which is really exciting. So one, I think, is Celia, or if anyone wants to tag on to that, is what is a practical example of what a conservation group can do with funding through state revolving funds, just to kind of ground it a little bit?
Yeah, I think we have two pretty good examples, or pretty good. One was the one that I mentioned kind of at the end, which was the Farmland Futures Fund initiative, which we're partnering with the Vermont Land Trust to do. And that's where Vermont Land Trust basically had this initiative where they were recognizing that intergenerational transfer of farms, what is it, a current and looming crisis, and that also an opportunity, but that it requires them to be able to access large amounts of capital and act quickly. And that partnership is one where we're basically bankrolling that and allowing them to put in place all of the things that they need to be able to transition those properties to sustainable agriculture that provides more natural resources benefits than usually it's traditional dairy that they're replacing. So that's a partnership where we're really happy, and we had to actually adjust our typical loan review timelines to allow a quick turnaround. So we basically structured that under interim financing as basically a line of credit for a lump sum over each year. And we're able to do that relatively quickly, but without any specific properties in mind. And then as projects come in, as specific farm properties they want to acquire come in, we can actually turn it around in a matter of, we've set our target as 2 weeks. For when they send us, we want to buy this farm property, to us being able to give them the cash that they can take to closing. That's been, this is the first year of it, and we actually just closed the first property last month. But so far that's working really great. The other piece, or example I'll hold up, another interim financing project where the town of Huntington in Vermont was a lot of help by Trust for Public Land and Vermont Land Trust to buy a town forest. And that's one where, even though the loan was actually going to the community, they needed the support of the land trust community, the land conservation community, to put the deal together, to make the case, to sort of do the administrative and managerial work, because the town didn't have the capacity.
Great. Thank you, Celia, for providing some of those examples. Ashley, we have a question for you. In terms of return for investors, does that come from, or can you say a little bit more about how that comes from the regulated entity selling the compliance? Can you speak a little bit more to that? Where the return from the investment comes from?
So let me be clear, there's no equity return on what we're doing. So we're not trying to start out with $1 in equity and at the end of the day produce $10 in equity. So but that said, we're trying to create a construct where the municipality, in David's example, David needed their water utility. I hope I get this right, David. Tell me if I'm wrong. That the Portland Water District was facing a choice. They either were going to invest in invest, fund the protection of waters that were strategic to their operations, or they were going to need to build, I believe, $150 million filtration plant. So there was a business case to be made. In our situation, the municipalities that we're dealing with have to reduce the pollutant loads that are coming into their municipalities. And so what they're fundamentally doing is purchasing pounds of sediment, nitrogen, or phosphorus reduction that we're providing through aggregating these practices on the land. And when they purchase, you take $1, you invest $1 in an agricultural practice on the land, you quantify the pollution reductions of that dollar, and that municipality purchases for $1.10 or $1.20, the municipality purchases, or maybe $1 or maybe 90 cents, right? The municipality purchases that value, and then the cash that flows from that purchase flows back to refund the cycle, to put the $1, you take the 10 cents or the 20 cents or the 90 cents, if you're if you're covering your costs or not, and then that $1 goes back in to do the same thing again. So that's the vision. And if we're able to achieve that vision, that is huge for conservation, because it means that the dollar's not just going out once. It means we're integrating a practice with someone who's with a lot of people that are benefiting and creating, again, a distribution stream. Was that a
great? Thank you.
Your answer? Sure.
Thank you. Yeah. And I think as we're thinking about ramping up to these projects that Celia is mentioning, or to this vision that Ashley's sharing, there is a question of, how do small organizations even get started? Like, what is that propelling to even start having these kind of conversations and thinking about it? And so, David, you had mentioned in your presentation the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities grant that helps get Sebago Clean Waters off the ground from a water utility just saying, yeah, we'll fund this, 333-acre pond. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that grant provided the initial capacity for Sebago Clean Waters? And David, you're muted, just to let you know.
I'll get it someday. I'm sorry, you asked about the grant, the $8 million grant, I think?
No, it's actually, the grant is the first seed grant, the U.S. Endowment for Forestries and Communities grant, and how that enabled the very start, what that offered the water district and the conservation groups. Can you speak to that a little?
A little bit. I'm not the expert on what they exactly did, but I mean, the grant allowed us to hire 2 contract people, who then was able to do outreach in the community, nationally, getting other organizations that can provide technical assistance to us. They did some local outreach, and they began the starting of the creation of the so-called Sebago Clean Water program itself. Is there more that you would like to know about that?
No, I think that's great. Just thinking about how to get some of the initial capacity to do things like hiring technical advisors, or to do an initial study to think about what would make a project even possible, or even just to do a map of the landscape. And I'm using that figuratively to say, what potential partners are out there? What strengths do they have? What can we offer? And how could we start this conversation? So thank you for mentioning that.
I just know, this effort led to us to be able to do an application for an $8 million grant from the that was part of the 2018 Farm Bill. So it had quite a good payback in that effort.
Great. Well, thank you all. I wish we could continue this conversation. There's clearly a wealth of information to share, and it's really exciting. So thank you all for sharing your time and your expertise and enthusiasm. For all those with questions, whether submitted or still brewing, thank you for your engagement. I hope you'll keep asking them and being bold and finding the next person to ask them. And I just, listening to this and just hearing that there's no longer, we don't need to have none of us need to have all the expertise in-house, that we have to reach out to other partners, even some that we hadn't thought of. And I think I remember in college reading a book from E.O. Wilson, and he said, ecologists don't need to be mathematicians, just find a statistician. So people don't need to be experts in policy or impact investing. Find a Celia, find an Ashley, find a David. So thank you all. I know we're at time, so I hope you'll follow up. Highstead is going to provide some additional resources from our speakers soon after the roundtable to learn more. I believe there might be some contact information. And with a big thanks to Highstead and the Conservation Finance Network and the tech team that made sure I didn't have to do all the Zoom functions, I will pass it back to Spencer and Lee to start us on the next conversation. Thank you all.
Thanks, folks. See if I can spotlight. Somebody got my spotlight there. Thank you. Wow, I suspect we could continue this discussion well into next week. There are a lot of salient points that I think we'll hope to enshrine and pull forward in this ongoing discussion. Just the points on the need for project pipeline, the need for unconventional partnerships, and to really question whether our comfort zone is how we're going to advance work at the pace and scale it needs to occur across the region. So lots to pick up there and continue on. Hadley, wonderful job moderating. Great job to the panelists. So there's been a form shared in the chat box on reflections and insights. It's a quick questionnaire we're going to ask you to fill out as we transition into this next session here. So please go ahead and just take a minute and fill that out with a quick response. I am then going to get the next panel started on natural climate solutions. We're thrilled to have Kavita Kapoor McLeod, principal of KKM Environmental Consulting, leading us on into this next session. So Kavita, I'll hand things over to you. I'll just circle back and plug that we do want people to fill out that reflection and insight questionnaire. Sorry to harass you all about it, but please check that out in the chat box and we'll get started. Kavita?
Thanks so much, Lee, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you to Highstead and Lee and the Conservation Finance Network and everybody behind the scenes that has helped pull this off. I'm Kavita Kapoor McLeod, as Lee mentioned, and I'm really excited to be moderating this panel with you today. I'm an environmental consultant, and I've been focused for many years on bringing science and policy together for climate change action. In the last year, I've been working on a project looking at the opportunity that New England forests present us with for climate change mitigation. So I know how relevant this panel is and how critical it is on how we take science and our knowledge of what forests and the landscape can do to implementation in order to leverage these natural forests, natural resources as a natural climate solution. So I'm just going to start with the big picture, and then we'll drill down on the details in this panel. We've got a critical climate emergency that's going to require significant action on the part of government at all levels, the nonprofit community, and the private sector to meet goals by 2050. Last year, we saw the private sector take a big leap. The number of companies with net zero pledges doubled from 500 in 2019 to more than 1,000 in 2020. And a recent report concluded that the market for these credits, carbon credits, could be worth more than 50 billion by 2030. So our objective today is to talk about the opportunities that exist through the carbon markets for the conservation community, highly relevant in a heavily forested region such as New England with such a strong conservation history, and to focus specifically on partnership models that are helping to facilitate greater access to the markets from private landowners. And as we all know, we have a high degree of private land ownership of forest land in New England. We're going to explore the opportunity natural climate solutions present us with, where recent science has shown that forests can yield meaningful carbon benefits. And we'll talk about how the science is being translated into implementation of forest carbon projects on the ground. To do this, we're lucky to have our panelists who represent the philanthropic, private, and nonprofit sectors working in partnership. And I'd like to introduce them now. We want to welcome Sasha Spector, who's the Program Director for the Environment at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. The Doris Duke Charitable Foundation has been making significant contributions to both the science behind the natural climate solution opportunity, as well as catalyzing implementation of these solutions on the ground. We also welcome Karen Watts, Principal Product Manager for Worldwide Sustainability at Amazon. And Amazon has, of course, made a significant net zero carbon emission goal and is investing in partnerships to increase natural climate solutions on the ground. And finally, we welcome Josh Parrish, Director of the American Forest Carbon Initiative at the Nature Conservancy. And he's going to take us to the ground to talk about how the Nature Conservancy is working in partnership with Amazon and the American Forest Foundation to develop the Family Forest Carbon Program. So welcome to all our panelists. I'm really excited for their presentations and the discussion that will follow. And I think first we're going to do a really quick poll and then get to our panel presentations. Well, this is fantastic. It looks like most of our participants here are already working on a carbon or other natural climate solution project, or are considering it. So it's a pretty large percentage. So that's great. I think this panel will be super relevant. Great. So with that, Sasha, do you want to go ahead first and kick us off here?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Yeah, great, my first slide. And thanks for the invitation and the opportunity to join all of you today. It's daunting to be among such a group of folks pushing the boundaries on so many different fronts for conservation and land protection and environmental endeavors in general. As Kavita mentioned, the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation has been making significant investments in natural climate solutions over the last 5 years. And so maybe it's good to start off just by talking about what they are. And at their very core, they're really, their efforts through management of land or waters to protect existing stocks of natural carbon pools, or take action to enhance those carbon pools, to enhance ecosystems' ability to capture and store carbon for the long term. And that really breaks down into three kinds of activities of which we're all really familiar. That's protecting ecosystems and the sequestration functions. So protecting forests, wetlands, and grasslands, or managing working lands better through forestry, farming, and grazing, or restoring these places so that they are shifting either from a low carbon state to a higher carbon state, or a higher potential carbon state through gradual complexification of the vegetation. Recent science from the Nature Conservancy and 16 or 17 other academic institutions working together projected the potential for this part of our climate solution set to be about a third of the entire set of emissions reductions and carbon capture by 2030. And so it's really important, because we're describing this both in terms of stocks of carbon and fluxes of carbon, that we're recognizing that the land sector is both a source of emissions, which can be reduced by changing practices, or preventing land use change, or a new source of carbon capture or removal. And that's really important, because by mid-century, in order to achieve a net zero pathway, we're going to need not just to be capturing and removing the current rate of carbon that the ecosystems of the world achieve now, but an additional 5 gigatons of removal by 2050. And for scale, the US emissions is a little over 6 gigatons. So that's an enormous amount of emissions that are going to be required to be removed by 2050. And our best, most available technology at this point is photosynthesis to achieve that. So about a third of the solution, but since this is a finance gathering, it's worth comparing that to how much money is actually flowing into natural climate solutions. And at the global scale, a little less than 3% of all global finance is flowing into natural climate solutions, relative to the energy shift and a whole lot of transportation initiatives and all the things that you're sort of familiar with and think of as the mainstream of climate action. So there's a really fundamental imbalance between the amount of carbon mitigation that we can achieve through the land and the amount of finance that's flowing through it. Can I go to the next slide, please? And to bring that back down to the US, a similar study focused on the US suggested that currently our forests are sequestering about 15% of our national emissions. We have to dramatically ramp that up along with wetland protection and restoration and management across working lands. And if we do that, we can remove about 20% of the nation's carbon emissions by 2030. That has to increase so that by the time we get to the middle of the century, a large percentage of remaining emissions in our US economy are being captured by the land. So that's really consistent with the new administration. And someone mentioned, how 30 by 30 might impact any of this sort of finance question. I think it remains to be seen, but the new administration's commitment to protecting 30% of our nation's lands and waters as part of a climate strategy, along with doubling the LWCF last year and a whole range of other policies that are on the way, including the idea of a carbon bank being set up by the Department of Agriculture and the deployment of public land restoration, means that there's going to be an enormous set of new public expenditures on this. And I'll come back to that idea in a second. Can I go to the next slide? Key, of course, to accessing all this is carbon finance. And there's been an enormous amount of experimentation, and mostly through crediting mechanisms. And that's, through the compliance market like California's, which we're familiar with, which has been around a while. We understand that it's constrained in scale. It has challenges in terms of duration and the complexity of monitoring, reporting, and verification. And so there's been an enormous new focus on the voluntary market. And we'll hear from my colleagues on the panel who will talk about that kind of project in just a few minutes. The market is nearly doubling year over year, and actually it's set to accelerate, as Kavita mentioned, maybe reaching $50 billion globally by 2030, which is really soon, because last year it was a little over 500 million. The largest component of the voluntary market is in natural climate solutions. It is on land-based interventions, and it's been driven largely by corporate interest, for corporations who are making net zero or science-based target pledges. We've been trying to support some of this new experimentation in the voluntary markets and other sectors of the carbon markets through the Natural Climate Solutions Accelerator, which has been a regranting program over the last 3 years run by the Nature Conservancy and some additional organizations as advisors, where the projects that have been funded have touched across the entire spectrum of managing forestry, farmland, grazing lands, and restoring forests and wetlands through compliance market mechanisms, voluntary market mechanisms, and standing up new private or kind of bespoke platforms for ecosystem services, developing new standards, accessing public dollars as well. The experimentation, I think, is incredibly healthy and is exactly what it takes to scale from 500 million to 50 billion in a decade. I do think, though, there are real challenges on questions around integrity of some of these credits, the ecosystem, the actual ecosystem benefits, the true additionality of some of these approaches, we can come back to that in the discussion, but I think there will be a shaking out in the not too distant future of credits and in the market here, because at the end of the day, corporations might be driving an enormous demand, but the atmosphere is a fierce critic, and whatever the atmosphere sees is the final arbiter on whether a credit is a real thing or not. And so I think that's something that we can certainly talk about. Next slide, please. But I want to actually step back a little bit from the carbon markets, and some of the great examples we just heard from in the water panel really reinforces this idea. And these are three organizations that we've been supporting to generate finance for natural climate solutions, some of which are incorporating carbon and some of which aren't. And this is my bid for the ugliest slide that you'll see today, but I hope that the story comes through that in order to make these big projects happen, it requires stacks of environmental services and benefits and monetizing as many as possible. So the Nature Conservancy developed a blended capital stack with our PRI dollars, private investors, public water bond, or revolving water fund investors, and is paying back through blended revenue that, yes, incorporates carbon through the compliance market, but also water, recreation leasing, renewable leasing, forestry, conservation payments. It takes all of these stacked together to make a viable business model that actually attracts large private capital. On the voluntary market, the City Forest Credits has developed a new verified carbon plus credit for urban trees and urban forest canopy that credits for carbon, but also is verifying stormwater, energy savings, and air quality benefits. It's not yet selling any of those and could disaggregate those benefits. But the point is that the multiple environmental services that are being provided by these urban trees need to be monetized across the whole stack ultimately to make sure that trees get in the ground and are cared for throughout their whole life cycle, so they ultimately deliver the carbon benefit. And in the Blue Forest Resilience Bond, they're combining the elements of fire resilience, which is a straight public investment from the state of California, with a water fund structure to the utilities in order to provide the capital required to pay back private or impact investors who've put up money to help restore forests in the Sierra to avoid catastrophic wildfire and bring ecosystem health back to the landscape. Of course, that has enormous carbon benefits, but Blue Forest hasn't even monetized those benefits yet. I just want to come back around to a little bit where I started, which is, the new administration's focus on public finance and the US Climate Alliance with their 26 states, a couple of dozen of which are now moving ambitious natural working lands programs through their state. There's going to be an enormous slug of just straight public money. We won't do this on the back of carbon markets only. We may see a carbon price either nationally or in some of these states, but we are going to have to spend money on this. And a lot of the folks in the new administration are recognizing that. So when I look at natural climate solutions finance right now, I think it's a stack of environmental services and benefits that are monetized. I think there's public investments. I think there's innovative public-private carbon bank ideas, all of which is going to be required to actually get to the kind of scale that we need by mid-century. So I'll stop there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sasha. I mean, again, we could talk about this for a lot longer, and I'm sorry we have to limit it, but I think that was just a terrific synopsis of how Doris Duke has been involved in this and where we are from 30,000 feet and how things are going to move in the future. And I'm sure we'll get into that in the discussion. So thank you so much. We're going to move now to Karen Watts from Amazon, and she'll give us her perspective on these partnerships and Amazon's role in this space. Thanks, Karen.
Yeah, hi, welcome. And thank you to Sasha and Kavita, and look forward to hearing from Josh from TNC next as well. So I'll talk a little bit about Amazon's work in this space. I manage Amazon's Right Now Climate Fund, which is our commitment to nature-based climate solutions. So as background, Amazon bases its decisions and actions on data based in science. And as you all know, scientists are telling us we have a limited window to make unprecedented headway on the journey to net zero carbon within the next 2 decades. According to the IPCC, the world will have to curb its carbon emissions by at least half by 2030, and then achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 to meet that target. This call to urgent action led Amazon to take greater action in this space and partnered with Global Optimism to found the Climate Pledge in 2019. The Climate Pledge is a goal for companies to be net zero carbon by 2040. It has 3 straightforward guidelines. First, measure and report carbon emissions. Second, reduce emissions within your own business and operations. That's a key one. And third, where you cannot reduce through innovations, investments, and changes to business, make up for the remainder with high quality carbon offsets. We are building out the Climate Pledge community as a place for companies to work together on ambitious actions to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2040. Currently, the Climate Pledge has over 50 companies signed on across a breadth of industries and sizes of company, and we're working on ways to collaborate on sending demand signals of decarbonization in supply chains, and also to take bold and urgent action towards nature-based solutions. Next slide. Cristiana Figueres, the former UN climate chief, also known as the architect of the Paris Agreement and a partner of ours on the Climate Pledge, has said, we need to reduce emissions from the energy and transportation sectors, in fact, all infrastructure, and we also need to increase the absorption capacity that can come from nature-based solutions. This is what we call the and also approach. At Amazon, we recognize that doing the hard work to decarbonize our business isn't optional, and we are making strides with investments in innovations in EV fleets, electric vehicle fleets, large-scale purchases of renewable energy, reducing materials impact from our products and packaging, and decarbonizing generally across our businesses. However, it's not enough. We also need to go outside of our own value chain to reduce and remove carbon. We are doing this through nature's potential for carbon removal and storage, which Sasha talked about earlier, including the protection and restoration of natural land, ocean, and water ecosystems. And of course, as this group knows, there are many other benefits of nature, such as conserving wildlife habitat, protecting biodiversity, improving water quality, and reducing flood risk. Amazon has committed $100 million to nature-based climate solutions through its Right Now Climate Fund. Nature-based carbon offsets provide an opportunity for businesses to go beyond their own operations to tackle some of the biggest challenges on the pathway to the Paris Agreement targets. But just buying carbon offsets won't cut it. The key here really is to ensure these offsets are actually resulting in a positive impact on climate change and are delivered with intent, integrity, and transparency. Next slide. Today, we have an immediate opportunity to improve the integrity of nature-based carbon offsets spanning conservation, restoration, and improved land management. Advancing offset integrity means rethinking the current approach, developing new science, and insisting on better investment criteria as a whole. Companies are taking action to improve monitoring, measurement, and verification to reach a higher standard of integrity. Amazon is really also taking a focus on additionality, making sure that the investment that we make would not have occurred, or the carbon mitigation would not have occurred without the investment that we make. So our first initiative from the Right Now Climate Fund was a $10 million grant to conserve, restore, and support sustainable forestry in the Appalachian Mountain region. This was in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy and American Forest Foundation. This nature-based solution empowers landowners of small forests to gain economic benefits while delivering sustainable forest management practices and protecting wildlife and watersheds. This grant also supported the forest carbon co-ops in partnership with the Nature Conservancy and the Vermont Land Trust, which I think I saw representation here today. This works with owners of mid-sized forests to use sustainable forest management and protection measures to connect to the carbon offset market. So next, I'll hand it off to Josh to talk a little bit more about these programs and other work that the Nature Conservancy is doing.
Thank you, Karen. And hello, everyone. And thank you for having me here today. I'm Josh Parrish with the Nature Conservancy. And I'm here to talk to you about some science, innovation, and partnerships that the Nature Conservancy has been working on in the last 3 years, and kind of how they touch down in the carbon finance, carbon credit space. First off, I just want to point out that the picture here, my first slide, is in Vermont. So we've got a northeast grounding for everybody, so they can be happy. So, as you heard Sasha mention, looking at natural climate solutions and looking at the science, forests represent the largest opportunity area in the United States to mitigate climate. And really in those 3 buckets, he said, protecting, managing, and then restoring, reforesting. Those 3 buckets are really big opportunity areas. So at the Nature Conservancy, we took the science about 3 years ago, in 2018 already, how time flies, and looked at who owned the forests. And it was really clear at that time that there was really a missing opportunity for the bulk of forest owners in the U.S. So what we came out with was family forest owners own roughly 36% of all of the United States forests, which is roughly 1/10 of the entire land area of the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii. When I put it another way, it's like Texas plus most of California. So that's a lot of family forests. So currently, those family forest owners really have no ability or very little ability to participate in climate finance, climate markets, and incentives that really are there to help them manage their lands and steward them and really conserve and improve the underlying ecological function and therefore the climate and carbon benefits. So next slide, please. So at the Nature Conservancy, kind of building on that, the science, building on who owns the land, and with the fact that nobody really had no family forest owners really had meaningful ability to participate, we came up with several strategies, which Karen just mentioned, that obviously Doris Duke and also Amazon have been big supporters of growing these. Come up with 2 strategies to grow and enable family forest owners, to participate. And I'm going to concentrate on the Family Forest Carbon Program today. Our goal by 2030 is to engage and enroll basically 20% of family forest owners across the United States. We're doing that really by our experience long experience in the carbon markets and our Working Woodlands program, which has been around over a decade, and trying to innovate and create essentially new systems and tools so landowners can have the ability to participate. And one of the things that came out of that 3 years ago was a partnership between the American Forest Foundation and the Nature Conservancy that has now manifested itself in the Family Forest Carbon Program, which is live and enrolling landowners right now in Pennsylvania. So to put this in perspective, if we are effective in enrolling 54 million acres of family forest owners, by 2030, that could translate to 100 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent a year of mitigation with that 20% alone. So we're really talking really big numbers, important numbers, as Karen and others have said and Kavita has said, around the urgency of this issue. And also just, that family forest owners need this help and we want them to participate. So what is the Family Forest Carbon Program? The Family Forest Carbon Program is essentially a program that enrolls landowners through a programmatic approach, not a project-based approach. Most carbon projects out there right now are just that. It's a project that's a standalone system. we use a programmatic approach. We're working with Verra and the Verified Carbon Standard to validate, actually right now we're going through validation, a brand new protocol that anyone can use globally and that can be used for unlimited number of forest practices that improve the underlying performance and condition of the forest and therefore carbon. The one novel thing, we need to make these systems more efficient, less costly, and really to really enable scale and family forest owners to participate. And then also the MRV folks have already talked about, lowering that as well and handling it at the program level and not the landowner level. And so what we've come up with is practices that we pay landowners a practice rate that in turn returns the carbon credits and carbon finance to our program to essentially be the fuel that that services all of the finance we need, the growth and everything else. So from a landowner's perspective, they're signing a contract with the Family Forest Impact Foundation. They're getting a payment to do carbon-friendly practices. And then this program's taking on all of the verification, validation, carbon finance, carbon sales. So we're really streamlining the process and creating a system that eliminates the barriers essentially to small family forest owner participation. And we're really excited about that because there's lots of opportunity in the U.S. and globally to improve management practices, to restore and reforest. It's another area we're looking at as well. So with that, we are in pilot phase now. We do go down to 30-acre parcel size, which is really several orders of magnitude smaller than current carbon project enrollment size. And we are launching a financial pilot, a larger pilot in the Mid-Atlantic Central Appalachians right now this year. And we will be launching in future landscapes, including your neck of the woods, in the future. So there's going to be an opportunity to work with land trusts, to work with other partners, foundations, corporations, to really grow this program, which we think does the best job, both in terms of like additionality. The way it works is you're judged against a group of your peers through active FIA plots for your performance versus the performance of the carbon. And also it's designed in a way to be the best fit possible for landowners. So it's very landowner centric, and we think a lot about the landowner journey. So how can this be a tool in landowners' toolkit to make their property more attractive for all the goals and reasons they own it, but also then for society at large and for climate and all kinds of other things like water and other ecosystem benefits. So with that, and I'll be obviously here to answer questions, we'll leave you with a video that Amazon put together working with the Hartman sisters and myself. And I will say I'm biased, but I think my kids are pretty cute in this video at the end, just to give it a little bit away. And I'll be here to answer questions. So thank you very much. Every forest has a story. We're working to write the next chapter of that story in a way that returns it in balance with nature. Through photosynthesis, forests absorb and store carbon. And conserving forests is critical to tackle climate change. The typical landowner has no forest management plan, and somebody offers them money for their large trees. All the trees that are smaller in the forest or left are going to store less carbon over time. The Nature Conservancy and the American Forest Foundation, working with Amazon, built the Family Forest Carbon Program as a way for family forest owners like the Hartman sisters to participate in being a climate solution.
My grandfather bought the farm in 1939. We didn't really care to divide the property. We wanted to keep the farm in the family. But it takes a lot to take care of a property.
When they need money, instead of cutting all of their timber in an unsustainable fashion, what we're doing in the Family Forest Carbon Program is providing plans and tools for landowners to store more carbon on their properties.
You know, the land will last a long time. You aren't going to be here that long, and it's your responsibility to take care of it.
Amazon's commitment to the climate pledge is very important. It's not simply about them buying carbon credits. It's about them reducing their emissions as well to combat climate change. My wife and I have 5- and 7-year-old daughters. Seeing them in the forest, it gives me hope that the future is bright. If we work together, forests can be one of the great solutions to fight climate change.
Thanks, Josh, for that video. Your kids are super cute. And thank you all for your presentations. I think we've really moved from the great needs that are out there and the huge commitments that have been made, and the large financial flows to this work that are expected, down to what's happening on the ground, and different kinds of ways of implementing these projects, and issues of additionality, and all of the things that come into carbon projects. So I think in terms of a question I have for all of you is just, given our audience, what are some entry points for conservation organizations and land trusts, private landowners into this space right now? I mean, it's a dynamic, evolving field of either the methodologies that are being used. There are other programs coming online that are targeting smaller family forest owners. If I'm a conservation organization or land trust, what do I need to know to sort of get involved with this at this time?
Well, I'd say, partnership is obviously a great way to do it, especially with a larger organization potentially that's working on this. But I think there's some other options out there. I think the compliance market was relatively transparent in the sense that you know who your buyer was and you knew the standards and the marketplace. As we go more and more into the voluntary space, matching up the off-takers with potential project developers and deciding on which standards are going to be used is going to create a lot more complexity. And so there are a handful of really significant size carbon brokers, essentially, or major developers, and I'm sure you've run into some like South Pole or others, but I think that's going to be an increasingly important function in this market, as well as sort of cooperatives, whether it's through groups of land trusts or regional groups of conservation groups that get together. The Land Trust Alliance is developing a platform for land trusts to access the market. So I think there's going to be both an aggregation and a cooperative function that's going to really start to evolve in the next few years.
And Kavita, I think there's things at play right now on, like, internationally, what constitutes a high quality voluntary carbon credit. So some of those things are playing out right now. I think also, corporations that are leading, like Amazon and others, are writing that story, indirectly, for what their preferences are and where they're seeing kind of pinch points, issues, and want to push, which I think is really, really positive, particularly for the corporations that are looking very carefully at quality. And the Nature Conservancy, one of our big goals in American Forest Foundation for the Family Forest Carbon Program is that other conservation organizations, government partners and others kind of think about this as it rolls out as another tool in the toolkit. On the previous presentation, I heard a little bit about kind of change, and this is what we've been doing for a long time. And I will say that this new tool, if we all work together, there's an opportunity really to link together kind of existing conservation, tools and incentives and other things with carbon. And when you add those together, it might be more attractive essentially to landowners, that we really want to change the behavior and get, all of these things on their property. So I just think there's a great opportunity to partner together. This program is not meant to be, supplement other activities and programs. It's meant more to be additive. So so I'm excited as this rolls out, that we can all kind of work together as a greater community to do that. And then lastly, like who organizations should think and work with, I think, you really need to step back and kind of assess what outcomes you're looking for as an organization first. Don't lead with the carbon and finance as kind of what you want to do. Think about the destination you want to, where you want to get in terms of destination, and then seek out those partners or, for-profits, non-for-profits, and others. And it's a building network, I'll say, that continues to grow and get stronger.
Thanks, Josh. Karen, did you want to weigh in on that question?
I think Sasha and Josh touched on some of the key topics for us as well. That we are looking for high integrity, high credibility projects with measurable and verifiable results. As I mentioned, we have a particular focus on additionality, but we're also looking for accurate measurement of carbon mitigation, not displacing negative actions to other locations. We're looking at the social and community benefits. So, there's a spectrum of factors that we're looking for.
Great. Well, before I move to some of the audience questions and answers, which are coming in the audience Q&A session, I just wanted to ask you, in terms of the work that you've done so far, if you had sort of one lesson learned or, a key takeaway from, what has happened in this space so far, or, any comments on remaining barriers that, would be good to address, that would be great to hear. And Josh, maybe you want to go first with a lesson learned from the family forest.
Well, I think, I've been in this space since 2009, the Nature Conservancy. And for me, the main lesson I've learned over the years is, change is, we continue to change, evolve, improve the science, the practice. And I'm excited about, I think it might've been in the chat a while ago, our approach we're taking with VCS and the Family Forest Carbon Program, and then the ability to nest as it comes online, remote sensing and other systems for both confirmation on the front end, but also then the monitoring, reporting, and verification on the back end. And I think when we start to link all those together and get the kind of, somebody had, said before, kind of what we're trying to do is, talk about what the climate's actually feeling, what's the flux, versus kind of predicting things in the abstract, and where technology and all that stuff comes together. I'm really excited about. So yes, and it's since 2009 to now is like, several generations of innovation, science, and change. So I just think, folks, it can be scary, but we need to embrace it and work towards kind of always improving.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. It's a very dynamic and fast changing space, and Amazon's really feeling an urgency and need to move quickly, looking at ways to scale programs and take models that can be expanded to more regions. That's what we really liked about the Family Forest Program. It's sort of creating a model or a template that can be taken to other regions very efficiently. And so, we're looking at ways where we can kind of expand this more broadly and take it to more regions. And that's generally how we're approaching our view of projects going forward as well.
Great. Sasha, did you want to comment before we move to audience Q&A?
I think they did a great job. I think agility is going to be really key here. It's a fast evolving space, that's for sure.
Great. Well, thank you all. I'm gonna move into some audience questions now. I'm gonna start with a question on, we've talked about carbon mitigation through photosynthesis, but there is, a kind of an ongoing conversation in the forest community about managed versus non-managed forests, and we have a lot of work to do in a short period of time. So the question is really, how do we advance these carbon mitigation goals more broadly across different pathways? And this kind of gets to the work that I've been working on with Highstead over the past year, looking at different ways that we can increase carbon storage and sequestration on the landscape, including, for example, through constructing out of mass timber and saving carbon both in the life cycle of the materials as well as storing it in the building. So I just wanted to ask, how you see removal of carbon from the atmosphere more broadly, in addition to the ways that we've talked about so far.
Well, I know that Amazon and a lot of others are also looking at things like mass timber, and certainly in New England, that's been a really active topic of discussion, including through the U.S. Climate Alliance's Natural Working Lands mechanisms for New England. And we're sponsoring a really significant life cycle analysis of mass timber right now that doesn't just look at the substitution effects of those materials for their carbon benefits, but looks at the landscape impacts and understanding in several major wood markets around the world. So I think that's a really important part of the life cycle story on some of these long-lived wood product ideas that has been sort of underrepresented in our assessment of whether these are true climate solutions or just incomplete carbon storage ideas. But I think there's also another element to your question, which is, non-forestry, sort of best practices kinds of approaches, whether it's improved forestry or regenerative agriculture and those sorts of things. And that's how to pay for proactive management that wouldn't be happening otherwise in our forests and landscapes, that actually does change the carbon trajectory, that could be additional, but is not relative to a harvest rate. And for lots of urban areas, for example, there are really substantial natural areas within lots of communities and urban areas where forest health is declining, and the municipal budgets aren't there to make sure that forest regeneration or invasive species are dealt with, and that's actually a significant component of their landscape-based carbon. How we find ways to pay for that, which is not a kind of an avoided loss, but an induced gain, is a really important part of this overall carbon equation. And whether that's applying better practices to forests or restoration practices to existing forests, or waterways or wetlands and things like that, that really enhance carbon, but don't have a market value associated with the product, I think is going to be an important question for us to address with new voluntary protocols or with just direct payments from public sources.
Great. Just a follow-on question, since you mentioned municipalities, we had a question about how are these programs helping municipalities that have aging city parks and unprotected land along the urban-suburban corridors where we know some of the forest conversion happens. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Sasha, do you want to talk about city forests? I mean, there's two components here. We actually, the way we're building this verified carbon, the VCS carbon standard, we're starting with family forest owners, but others could pick it up and create essentially practices for city parks, practices for lands that are municipal owned, and benchmark against other municipal owned lands through this. So I think there's really some interesting opportunities for state, local, all types of land ownership types. So we could do that. But I do know that, Sasha, they and others have been working on solutions for, I think it's both, the management and preservation of trees in cities, and then also just the establishment. And so maybe Sasha, you can talk to that a little bit specifically.
Yeah, really briefly. And Karen, I'd love to know if you're seeing other approaches like this, but City Forest Credits actually has 2 protocols that are both verified. One is a planting protocol where, additionality is easy to spot. You've added trees, you've guaranteed their survival for 20 years, and you're taking credit for that carbon. But they also have a protection or preservation protocol, which has to do with existing forest land in municipalities, where you're verifying that those trees will not just be, you'll basically maintain that forest stand over time. And we can see in other parts of those municipalities or adjacent kind of regional municipalities what the trajectory of municipal forests are, and they're not typically good in a lot of cases. And so we can kind of benchmark against that regional average.
I guess I would say I've seen a few carbon offset methodologies around city forests, but the scale is much smaller than some other forest opportunities. But what Amazon has done sort of outside of the carbon offset sphere is we supported another of the Nature Conservancy's programs in Europe and Germany, which is called the Urban Greening Program, which works with municipalities to adapt a urban planning mechanism to be able to increase the nature and use nature to solve some of the problems that urban areas are seeing with climate change, like extreme heat, flooding, loss of biodiversity. And so this program tries to work with cities to enhance that, and that model will be replicated across multiple cities in Europe.
That's great. I think the connection to the urban landscape is really important, also for equity and environmental justice reasons that Spencer and Lee mentioned in the beginning of the roundtable. So I think movement on that front, it's happening, and it sounds like it's going to intersect with a bunch of other goals and concerns that states have in the U.S. as well as abroad. I'm pretty much at time here, and we could go on talking for a long time about these really interesting issues that come up on scaling the forest carbon market. There are questions in here about when the family forest program will roll out in other states, and other questions that maybe we can get to when we meet again in the small groups later in the morning. I just wanted to thank all of the audience for this terrific discussion on what's happening in this space, and how these partnerships across sectors are really helping to move this market, to encourage innovation and experimentation, as Sasha said, and to help us bring this to the landscape scale that's necessary to meet some of the goals, and to absorb some of the funding flows that are going to come to meet those goals. So thank you all again. I think we've all learned a lot about what's happening in this space, and how conservation organizations, land trusts, and individuals can become engaged. And I look forward to carrying on the conversation when we can. And again, thanks to Highstead and Conservation Finance Network, and all the others that have worked to put this together. And thank you so much to our panelists again.
Wonderful, Kavita, Karen, Josh, and Sasha. Thank you so much for that fascinating panel. You could see from the flurry of activity in the chat that this is a topic that is of great interest to the whole audience here. I know there's gonna be a lot more good discussion in the small group breakout. And don't forget that after the roundtable is over, we'll be sharing some resources from all the speakers to some of the things they've been mentioning and some of the ideas they've had. So thank you, Kavita, for just doing a superb job moderating a really important topic. We're going to take a break now for 10 minutes. We are going to come back at 11:15 sharp. In just a second, a poll question, survey question will pop up. There it is in the chat now. Take a minute to fill that out and let us know what's on your mind about natural climate solutions and how you're eager to engage with it. We're going to use that information as the basis for some of our conversations and programming going forward. When you come back from getting a snack and taking whatever break you need, we'll play a little bit of musical chairs. When you hear the music stop, find a seat as quickly as you can, and we're going to get going again for our third panel on healthy people and communities. Thank you so much.
Quick mad dash for a healthy snack, perhaps, or that cup of coffee. But we are going to get started with this next session. Do we have our fearless moderator, Sean Thackerdine from Doris Duke, with us?
Oh yeah, I'm here.
All right, you're back from break. That's good enough for us. Sean, I'm so thrilled to hand the reins over to you for session 3, Healthy People and Communities. And I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lee. And thanks y'all for joining us today. And for Spencer, Lee, Tara, and the team for bringing us together. It's exciting to be moderating a panel with a focus on healthy communities and people in the context of a conservation finance roundtable. I think that's already a win, but also, and probably with some bias here, I think it's the beautiful apex of an exciting arc of panels about breakthrough partnerships. As we did in past panels, there'll be a little bit of a poll that'll come up now that will circle back around to just as we get going here. But as that's happening and as you're completing that poll, I'll just give you a little bit of introduction. My name is Sean Thackerdine, the Program Associate at Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Spencer referenced earlier that I'm at Doris Duke Conservation Foundation. And I can leave you assured that Sasha and I are hard at trying to get that name change done. But as we get to ground on that task and really try and make some of those shifts, I think, maybe some of the questions from our other programs will be really, how do we lift up the people we serve and address some longer standing issues in the conservation community? As Spencer and Lee shared context in the beginning, today is about a beyond and innovation ethos. It's about multi-solving, and those are all words that definitely relevant here in this context. And it really couldn't be more relevant given the context of climate ambition folks have shared in past panels, but also given the history and pattern of jarring injustices that have been made bare in the past year. COVID-19 and racial injustice have come to fore in ways that have caught most of the country off guard. But they have revealed the unjust land use patterns and their disproportionate effects on low income and communities of color. And as the country reckons with these challenges, the New England context is ever more important. As an example, 80% of forested land, yet one of the most densely populated areas of the country. Similarly, more than 20% of the land area already protected, and extraordinary kudos to New England conservationists in the last quarter century. But in thinking about the grander ambitions in the country, namely 30 by 30, and as New England hops, skips, and jumps its way to 30% protected, and as wildlands and woodlands would lift that even higher, the question is, how does conservation relate to community to meet their needs, their other needs now, and how does that change our work? So it'll be really interesting to see what folks think from that poll, where we're at. Yeah, well, it's extraordinary, and it's great that folks are here. 77%, and I'm really excited by this low factor at the bottom here. Only 3% aren't sure where to start, so I think we're off to the races there already. We have a star-studded panel to help us get to some of these questions, split equally on housing and health backgrounds, with many of them sporting some deep conservation stripes. We'll be hearing about some exciting projects and what we can learn from them. Bobby Cochran, partner for community resilience and innovation at Willamette Partnership. We have Lori Coyner, Medicaid director at the Oregon Health Authority. We have DC Shante Hanks, deputy commissioner at Connecticut Department of Housing. And we have Maggie Superchurch, vice president, healthy and resilient communities at Conservation Law Foundation. So at the beginning here, we'll probably get started. Bobby, why don't you kick us off with your...
I will. Thanks, Sean. And it's really good to be here, everybody. Hi, I'm Bobby. I work with Willamette Partnership out here in Oregon and across the West. We're a conservation organization that really looks at conservation through a lens of what that can do for human health and community development. And part of why I'm here today is really to make the case that each one of us is a public health provider. It looks like 77% of you are already thinking in that direction. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that means, but then also kind of making the case of when you do the internal work, really thinking of what you do to promote health and what you do to promote health equity in particular, how that opens up additional doors when you show up with community, and how each one of us might get in position where we could actually access a $5 million investment from a local hospital or health plan. So just in terms of kind of thinking, next slide, I think that's perfect. No, back one, nice. So just in thinking of kind of the concept around health, for me, health is everywhere. And in fact, the data starts to show that 90% of our health is determined and connected more to our zip code than our genetic code. For example, if I'm here in Portland, Oregon, but in Portland, Maine, there's a census tract in kind of South Portland where life expectancy is 9 years different than just a neighboring census tract just right next door. So that's because housing, environment, school, work, and all the various forms of racism that have been built into those institutions over the years aren't making us healthy. And in fact, the American Public Health Association has recognized that racism is a public health crisis. And so when we're starting to think about health, it's not merely the absence of disease, it's not health care, it's really that complete state of physical and mental well-being. And when you start to think about that, and actually there's a number of healthcare institutions that are moving in this direction, you start using words like upstream public health, the ecosystem of partners, a lot of kind of conservation words that we're using. Next slide. And once you start kind of looking at upstream public health, preventative kinds of health, you start realizing a bit of how broken our healthcare system is in the United States. So since 1990, United States and Switzerland have been the most expensive healthcare systems in the developed world. And over the last 30 years, the amount of cost increase in the United States relative to Switzerland increased a lot, but our outcomes aren't any better. So Switzerland is the second most expensive health system, but they get the second best outcomes in the world. The United States doesn't get anywhere near that level of outcomes. If we had just spent the same amount per capita that Switzerland does, we could have covered an area of the entire state of South Carolina in solar panels. So you just think about that 18% of GDP that's swirling in the healthcare system that's being spent on stuff that's not actually making us healthy. There's a lot of opportunities for new kinds of partnerships. And next slide, we actually have the science that demonstrates that time in nature makes us healthier. We'll send out some resources later, but we have really good science on just the correlations that we can see increased physical activity, reduce stress, reduce early stages of depression, tackling insomnia, increased social cohesion, improved air quality, reduced extreme heat exposure. A whole range of different health benefits have been documented, and we're actually getting much better at kind of talking about dose response as well. How much time in nature for which different kinds of populations and different structures of nature. And then there's a range that we don't know as well, and we're trying to fill in some of those gaps, but we can make those links, specific. And so as you start thinking about, well, if we know the science is there, there's a couple of basic activities that you all as conservation folks do that improve health. One is more green stuff. So if we're planting trees, protecting natural areas, increasing the accessibility for that green stuff. So that's looking at kind of trails, going beyond ADA compliance to really be fully accessible. And then also thinking about my experience running by myself in the woods is different than, say, a Black man running in the woods by himself. And we've experienced that over the last year. And just recognizing that those real barriers to accessing the outdoors and perceptions that the outdoors is not for us is one of our biggest barriers to do and undo. And then I think the last thing that I think is really important for health promotion is who actually has power in making decisions about the outdoors and nature and who's involved. So the last panel talked about carbon credits. I think thinking about who's making those kinds of decisions to actually build power in community can increase health as well. So I'll kind of wind down there and get ready to hand it off to Lori here. But there is money in healthcare, and that $5 million investment opportunity is there. There's a health system right now that is offering $5 million loans at 1% to 3%, and half of those loans are not securitized. So you don't need various forms of collateral to access those loans. I was looking from state of Massachusetts, $800 million from hospitals were spent on community benefit. And we can pull that up all the way from Boston to Athol. So with that, Sean, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bobby. And upstream is definitely a word to keep track of. And as we do that here, we'll be great to transition to Lori in the state Medicaid arena. Lori, take it away.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. So I'm sure you're wondering why is a Medicaid director here, because I don't typically deal in conservation except in my personal life. But I want to make some connections for you that kind of build on what Bobby talked about, and maybe offer some hope for why a Medicaid director and other people within the healthcare sector should be meeting with groups like you in terms of land trusts and conservation. So let me tell you a little bit about Medicaid in Oregon. I'm going to hit my timer here so I don't talk too long. Let me tell you about Medicaid in Oregon. We cover 1 in 4 Oregonians, actually a little bit more now with COVID. So in Oregon, our population is roughly 4 million. We have 1.2 million members in the Oregon Health Plan. That constitutes about $16 billion program. That's just the general fund portion. So the part that our state covers is about 25% of our total state budget. This is true in roughly every state. It's not, the numbers aren't exactly the same, but similar across the entire country and the 6 US territories as well. In Oregon, we're unique in that we have our Medicaid program is run by health plans that are local and regional. So they're smaller, they're invested in the community, and the Oregon Health Authority that is part of Medicaid and includes public health has a new strategic goal of reducing eliminating health inequities in 10 years. So we have a really strong focus on health equity, and also not just healthcare, but the health of the individuals that we serve. Bobby talked a little bit about how there are emerging mental health benefits to the outdoors. And I guess I just want to point out that for our Oregon Health Plan, we cover physical health services, oral health services, and behavioral health, which includes substance use and mental health services. So it's a really, and that's an increasing part of our budget. And it's also, there's a disproportional use of behavioral health services by people of color. So it's an area that we have a lot of work to do. And I think a real potential opportunity for this collection or cooperation between conservation and Medicaid programs. So as I mentioned, our state's pretty unique in that we we really try to start thinking about health. So I'm not a public health person. We have a public health program. So this is really thinking about upstream, as we talked about, upstream health promotion for our members, because as healthcare costs increase, that's a huge hit to our state budget, and we have real need to keep that costs down. And one of the ways to do that is to improve the overall health of our members and kind of get ahead of it. So what will it take, I think, to really push this agenda around, health in the outdoors? I think one piece, and you'll hear more later, is around systems thinking. So we need to get to places where we have Medicaid that has dollars, housing that gets federal dollars for housing, and environmental conservationists, land trust all together at the table to talk about how to build community resources, particularly in areas where we have high health inequities, and that's not just for urban areas. We know that rural communities really struggle with access to outdoors, just in terms of a safe environment. The other thing is this focus on the equity agenda. I think we're going to see more of. It was very highlighted, for example, in COVID. So let me give a quick example. We have these big mass vaccination sites in this Portland. People in the outlying counties, lots of Latinx community, really don't trust going to a big mass vac site. So we are working with, smaller clinics and all with mobile units that are going out to fields and to meet community members where they are so they can receive vaccines. So it takes that kind of alternative thinking about how to move the system in a positive way. And I urge more research. We really need to show the dotted line between green spaces, activities that promote wellness, like Bobby mentioned, walking paths, access to green spaces, and show that dotted line to health improvement. And that's really where you can start leveraging healthcare dollars. Let me give an example on housing. There is a study here where we provided housing for people, 1,600 people, and on the Oregon Health Plan. And we saved almost $1 million in 1 year on healthcare spend. So building housing that has access to green space is vitally important. And again, a place where I think we can leverage more of a systems thinking approach. And I will sign off with this idea of social determinants of health in general. We do have one of our coordinated care organizations that works with local health councils that have power to decide how the money's spent. And I think this is vitally important when working with communities of color, that redistribution of power is important. And so they funded things like a High Desert Food and Farm Alliance that works with farmers, or a school district that it promotes physical activity and outdoor environments for kids in school. And so the more that we can put the money into communities' hands to make decisions about what's best for them, the better off we'll all be. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lori, and it's extraordinarily heartening to hear so much of this, especially coming from your position. I think exactly as you mentioned, bringing folks to the table, especially about housing, leads perfectly into our next conversation, led by Deputy Commissioner Hanks, who will be talking about a project in her state of Connecticut.
Good morning. Everyone's on mute, so I can't tell. It's so different than when you're in person and everyone responds, good morning. Can everyone hear me? Just kind of thumbs up or?
Good morning, Deputy Commissioner. You're great.
Thank you.
Hello.
The in-person interaction with folks, but we are making do. So again, good morning. Happy Hump Day, actually. So I just want to thank you for inviting me to participate in today's panel. I love having the help, though, of I don't have to post my own slides, so this is great. So what you see here is Resilient Bridgeport. So the state of Connecticut was one of 13 states awarded National Disaster Resiliency Funds by HUD in 2015. It was determined by the department, it was determined that the Department of Housing would be the lead agency for this project. And I gotta say, since we've started, we are the lead. I'm the project manager here. I've been with the agency since 2019. I was appointed by Governor Lamont. And although my background is the social sciences, I have learned a wealth of information from our ecologists on our team and our arborist consultants. It's amazing work that we're doing. And I'm happy to say that we've also enlisted the help of our sister agencies, Department of Transportation with the construction piece, and the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. As you can imagine, both agencies bring their expertise to this project. So although DOH is the lead agency here, I'm definitely locked arm in arm with my two sister agencies. So these projects, they're HUD awarded grants, and some of the funds are going to be funneled through our Sandy program, which is our disaster recovery program, which is through the Department of Housing. The flood risk prevention project, it consists of an earthen berm, and that's on the right side on your screen here. And it's a permanent structure that's designed to act as a barrier to floodwaters on land, similar to a seawall or dam. And it also has gates that are going to be open typically, and the only time that those gates will have to be closed is in case of a storm, similar to a Sandy or greater. This project, the FRRP Flood Risk Prevention Project, also consists of a pump water station. This project is on the eastern side of the park, if you will, and that's where you see the red bubble. And it also will consist of the Resilience Center, and I'll speak a little bit more about that. The other resilient project, which is on the left side of your screen, is Rebuild by Design. This is also a HUD-funded project, but it's a separate office in DC. This department was established by former HUD Secretary Sean Donovan, and Connecticut was one of only 3 states awarded the funds along with New York and New Jersey. This project will consist of a pump station, stormwater park, street extension, and elevation. This project provides egress and mitigation for Iranistan Avenue and Johnson Street, which is the street that we are going to extend and elevate. And it's also the home of a new housing development project that will provide affordable and market rate units. Both projects is the gateway to Park Avenue, to Seaside Park, but this one in particular, the RBD project, Rebuild by Design, this is a gateway to Park Avenue. If you're familiar with that area of Bridgeport, it's kind of, as soon as you kind of drive right under the train tracks, it's kind of your entrance into the University of Bridgeport and then Seaside Park. So we're very proud of both projects because they both rest on the east and the western entrances of Park Avenue. Seaside Park, I feel like everyone should know, anyone from Connecticut knows Seaside Park, but Seaside Park is a 300-acre park inspired by Central Park with the same designer, Frederick Law Olmsted. The coastal flood defense system is designed to provide flood protection to the historic resources of Seaside Park, as you can see in our image, and the Freeman homes. Those houses they were the homes of Mary and Eliza Freeman, and also that community is Little Liberia, which is where homes were built by freed Blacks back in 1848. And there's also the Cottage District, those small homes. And so we are building this project around that community to also preserve that community while avoiding any adverse impacts to these historic properties. Further, Freeman houses are proposed to be our preferred location for our Resilience Center. So we're working very closely with the community on this, and that's important. Resilient Bridgeport will protect the neighborhood from floods, storms, and sea level rise. And so that we had to take the time to do this right. As I mentioned, the Department of Housing was awarded these grants in 2015, right? And it's 2021. And just recently, through the omnibus bill that was passed in basically the 11th hour of the last congressional session, we were granted an extension. This project was supposed to conclude by by September of 2022. And now we've been given a year extension to 2023, because as I said, 13 states were awarded these funds, and these are huge projects, and there's a lot of steps involved, and there's a lot of stakeholders and property owners involved. So you have to do it right, and you have to include not only those landowners, obviously, but the community as well, which we're very proud of. Throughout this whole process, the community has been involved and been an active partner, if you will. So at this point, we can go on to the next slide. And that just shows the FRRP side of the project, which is where the earthen berm will be built. And I think it's hard to get a visual for folks when you're down on the ground sometimes, because you don't really see how this earthen berm will hold back or act as a barrier to floodwaters. But as you can see here from an aerial shot, where the purple line goes through, kind of magenta-ish, where that will happen. And like I said, the gates will stay open. So in terms of, egress on any given day is fine for the utility companies that this is being, for the most part, built on. And that's what also makes this project very interesting, is that there's so many parties involved and at the table. All of our resilient Bridgeport projects, all of the aspects of it are on private property. We have utility companies at the table, the University of Bridgeport, the Freeman Homes, the Cottage District. Well, Seaside Park, it's public in a sense because it's owned by the city of Bridgeport, but there's all these players involved. And then on the other side, the RBD side, we have the Housing Authority. They are the landowner for the street elevation, where we're building the stormwater park and the pump station, but they are leasing that land to a developer that is building the new Windward development, which consists of market rate and affordable units. Next slide. So that gives you an idea of how that's going to look, as if Bridgeport needs any more parks, but we'll take it. We are the park city. So as you can see towards the right side, you see the stormwater park. So that park will run right through the middle of this new development. So that's going to be wonderful on Park Avenue. Again, if you're familiar with that entrance into the south end of Bridgeport, right before you get to the University of Bridgeport, you will be greeted by Windward development. And as you can see, it's going to be beautiful. And that side of the park, the western side, is also where Iranistan is, and that's your entrance to the beach. So we are what I consider the third phase. There's many phases. We could call it phase 3B. We're moving towards 60% design of the berm and starting design of rebuild by design, which is the stormwater park, the street elevation, and extension that you see here. And it's important to note that the reason why we both projects have the same deadline, but the reason why we started with FRP, as you can imagine, those were the first slides. There's so many moving parts there, so many landowners. There's a lot involved there. So we started with that side, and the stormwater park, and the pump station on the RBD side, we're working around the development that's happening there. And a pump station, I kind of think of it as like a car engine. It comes for the most part assembled. You just kind of have to, modify it to fit where you need it to go. But we're good on the timing over there. That project it's running like clockwork. And we're also mindful, me being a Bridgeport native, I was very mindful of our timeline and how we can't have construction interfere with traffic going to and from the beach during the summer. So we anticipate starting construction on RBD spring of 2022 and FRP, which is the other side where the earthen berm is located, fall of 2022. And again, HUD funds both projects, and we have to expend those funds by September of 2023.
Thank you so much, Deputy Commissioner Hanks. An extraordinary project, and certainly one we'll be diving into more shortly. Transitioning to the next, we have Maggie Superchurch, who will be showing a lot of how private investment can come to the table and impact investing can be of service in this work. Maggie, take it away.
Great, thanks so much, Sean, and really appreciate the comments from the other panelists. I've learned a lot today and look forward to sharing a bit of our work with you all. So many of you, I think, know Conservation Law Foundation. I see some friends and colleagues on the call, but for those who don't know us, We are a New England-wide regional environmental organization. Our vision is a healthy and thriving New England for generations to come. And our mission is to protect New England's environment for the benefit of all people. And although a lot of people know CLF principally for our legal work, we also use science and markets to create solutions that preserve natural resources, build healthy communities, and sustain a vibrant economy. And so I think the conversations today about how people and conservation solutions have to work together is really core to our mission and to the way that we think about what it means to do conservation work. I'll also say, as we wrapped up our strategic plan last April or so, we've really tried to think about the intersection between climate, conservation, and communities with a strong focus on systems level solutions, recognizing that we really have to tackle some of these big challenges through a sort of systems approach that recognizes the role that different sectors play and the various kinds of tools that we need to bring to the table to develop solutions that really work. And in the context of today's discussion about how these different pieces fit together, I wanted to share a quote from a recently published report by the Surgeon General just last month that really, I think, speaks to the notion that we can't separate the various needs for health and safety from housing, from transportation, and a thriving natural world. And so all of these pieces are really part of what it takes to create healthy communities and healthy places. And importantly, a lot of the issues and challenges we see around equity and access to resources really have their roots in neighborhood conditions and thinking about how all the various factors in neighborhoods either impede or promote health and well-being for the people who live there. The other point that's important about this report is it really calls on businesses as stewards and stakeholders and really calls out the role of the private sector, including healthcare, in thinking about how to create healthy communities. This is not just the job of government or neighborhood associations or conservation organizations or housers, but it's really all of our job. And the role of finance and business in that process is critically important. Should go to the next slide, please. So I wanted to briefly today talk about some work we've been doing in the healthy community space. And it's a much longer story and happy to share more, and we'll have some follow-up resources to share after today's presentation. But I wanted to talk briefly about our work on the Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund, which has been a longstanding effort at Conservation Law Foundation, dating back to about 2013, 2014, and an effort we undertook in partnership with the Massachusetts Housing Investment Corporation, a community development and financial institution that's been a longstanding partner of ours. And the origin of this work really came out of some efforts that we and others had been involved with through our regional planning agency, looking at what's called the Metro Future Plan for Boston, which undertook an effort to try to look at where development was occurring, should occur, and what that meant for communities and for environment, among other things. And the upshot of that report was that development was not happening where we collectively would want it to happen because we were seeing sprawl, we were seeing increased greenhouse gas emissions, we were seeing increased segregation, lack of access to opportunity, and that all of that was really heading in the wrong direction. And without some kind of change in policy, practice, and finance, that pattern was likely to persist. And so in combination with a number of other organizations, we set out to really think about the finance piece. What were the capital gaps and needs that would enable development patterns that promote health and well-being, reduce carbon emissions, and create healthier and more thriving communities. And that really was the origin of our Healthy Neighborhoods Equity Fund. And so over the course of several years, in partnership with Mass Housing Investment Corporation and a number of others, we started to really think about not just sort of how to invest to create a set of outcomes around, say, housing units created or reduced greenhouse gas emission from transportation, but really centering the whole body of work on the notion of healthy neighborhoods and what were the things that could produce healthy neighborhoods and how would we screen and monitor for those impacts in the context of an investment fund. And so part of what was important in that early work was really creating partnerships with the public health community and understanding what kind of literature and evidence existed that links development, particularly transit-oriented development, to health outcomes. And so that journey really led to the creation of a series of metrics that we used in our first fund and now in our second fund. And you see a graphic snapshot here that helps us to think holistically about all the various elements of health in place that we can screen for and think about as we approach the investment process. And so part of what's important about that is it really spoke to and has continued to be an important part of the way we engage with healthcare in this fund. So let me just tell you a little bit about the structure of the fund, and then we'll come back to the metrics themselves. I think it's important in the context of all the discussions today about innovative finance and how to really respond to the needs that we see, to note that we also approach this problem of a financing gap by trying to really take a deep dive on the nature of the problem. So what was the missing ingredient that was preventing the kind of development that you see represented in the metrics here from happening at scale? And one of the key needs identified was the lack of long-term patient equity financing. And so that was what we set out to try to build. The other piece of the puzzle was that the kinds of development that we were talking about was often perceived to be riskier. And so we were seeking both lower return, higher risk capital, and trying to keep that money in for longer. And so we ended up building a capital stack that included a mix of public and philanthropic dollars that essentially took a first loss position, and institutional and individual capital, particularly banks, and very importantly for us, healthcare, that was also willing to come in alongside. And together, that blended capital stack allowed us to deliver equity to developments that really needed it, and could actually produce a modest economic return while advancing our broader mission of creating healthy neighborhoods. And the use of these metrics has really been key, from the start of the fund till now, to create some transparency, accountability, to communicate with developers, and to create a consistent series of benchmarks for how the investments we support, we expect will produce benefit. And so there are about 100 or so data points underneath the metrics you see on the screen here. Some of these are qualitative, some of them are quantitative. We spent a lot of time thinking about how to do this kind of screening, and we're using all of these metrics for our second fund launching now, which includes Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. If you can go to the next slide. So just to wrap it up, I wanted to share a slide of the very first investment that Fund 1 made in 2015. This is a development called Chelsea Flats. That's part of a much larger redevelopment of a neighborhood called the Box District in the city of Chelsea, just north of Boston, that was heavily contaminated. It had been the home of box manufacturing facilities for a long time, and was really part of a very neighborhood-driven, community-driven effort to redevelop the whole neighborhood for mixed income housing, beautiful playground, as you see on the right, new streets and sidewalks, power upgrades, utility improvements, really a kind of well-rounded approach. And that development really demonstrated for us kind of what the potential was for a development like this that's community-driven, health-focused, and able to access and take advantage of the kind of equity we can provide, as well as other public sources. So to date, the fund has now completed investments in 9 developments in Eastern Massachusetts, totaling over 550 units of mixed income housing, a lot of other exciting outcomes. And we're now well on our way to launching our second fund. So I will leave it there, but happy to share more resources. And thanks so much. Great to be with you all today.
Thanks so much, Maggie. And we've had some questions filtering in here, and definitely some of them that we want to kick up to really address head on. This one great question in the chat about anti-displacement. And so it's just would be very curious to hear from our panels, how it is that that is being factored into the work, both in health and housing.
It's a great question. I'm happy to jump in. This is something we've thought a lot about in the context of how we measure and screen for the fund, but also recognizing that the investments we make are only one part of a much bigger ecosystem of development. One of our areas of priority is to focus on neighborhoods where there's been real engagement with the community and setting a vision and direction. And that has been reflected in, for example, more inclusive zoning codes locally, commitments of affordable housing dollars from the city and the state, So a really affirmative commitment to ensuring that residents, have affordable places to live both now and in the future, and that we're not trading, on the one hand, affordability for quality of life or access to healthy places on the other. The challenge, of course, is that these are really regional issues. And so what we do in one community inevitably has impacts on another community. And so part of what we hope is that by modeling an approach that says we need to be thinking about all these things together, that we see this kind of healthy neighborhood development in more places. So it's not a scarce resource, right? So it isn't the kind of thing that, you only get access to if you can afford it. And that people have some choice to stay and they have some choice to move on. And the other thing I'll just say is through our Healthy Neighborhood Study, which is a 5-year longitudinal study in partnership with a number of community residents and organizations, we've seen that one of the most powerful elements of all this as neighborhoods are undergoing change is a concept that our residents describe as ownership of change. The idea that if you have ownership over the change in your community, it's connected to better health and better outcomes. And so that shouldn't be a surprise as we think about our own sense of control in our lives and how that impacts our well-being. But thinking about that at a neighborhood scale really ties it back to that idea of civic muscle and connection to place. And so that's actually something we screen for and something we think is incredibly important.
Yeah, I think I completely agree, and think it's important to really lift up community control, and definitely would like to highlight that as well. Would some of y'all like to talk about how community control factors into your work and how it begins to reorder some of the priorities that we're seeing here?
Oh, I definitely could do that. Absolutely. When I came on board, we were right before we were in the process of formulating the information we needed for our final EIS, which is our final environmental impact statement to HUD and FEMA. So even though Resilient Bridgeport will protect neighborhoods from floods, storms, and sea level rise, we had to take the time to do it right, and we were required to get the buy-in from the community. So even though we explained, this project will protect future economic revitalization, that used to be a very thriving neighborhood with a lot of family-owned businesses. This will also, the opportunity to bring that back is possible with this project. Property values, increasing those property values over there, and just overall the quality of life for the current residents. I mean, during Superstorm Sandy, it flooded terribly over there. So we were thinking of these things and building with equity and social justice in mind. But as far as the community was concerned, although those things are obviously very important, in order for them to agree, they had to, first of all, have input, but they wanted to be certain that we did not build what they perceived as a big obstruction, a big concrete wall down Main Street. That was very important. And it actually was, and just thinking about it without seeing a visual, right? It doesn't sound good. The idea of building a wall through your neighborhood, a brick wall, no one would want that, or a big concrete wall. So that's what they perceived this earthen berm to be. So when I came on board, being a Bridgeport native and understanding what that community means, the historical properties that are there, landmarks. I mean, it's just, and it's a gateway to, it's the eastern entrance to Seaside Park. It's very important. And I couldn't imagine a wall just getting a visual without having actual renderings. And so what I did was, first of all, I wanted to set up a meeting with the community, let them know that, someone right from their hometown is involved. I worked with my consultants to make sure that we had good visuals. I said, we have to put on a different hat here. We have to look at this as someone from that community and not as folks that this is what we do day to day. So what we did was we organized a social with the community. And the consultants really bought into this and even said, you know what, for the kids, let's have an ice cream truck out there. Let's just make it really nice. And we had goggles that we used so that they get virtual renderings of what the two alignments would look like, because we still hadn't had the final say on whether we were going to submit the Eastern or Western alignment. We knew that the Eastern was the one that was more favorable because it would be kind of hidden in a sense on the utility companies' properties. but the Main Street alignment would allow us to build on a municipal owned property, which is obviously a lot easier. So we were able to give them virtual renderings and a walking tour, and that changed everything, I feel. First of all, they were very grateful that we took the time to do that. And it just gave them a better rendering. You can imagine, when you're watching these video games that almost look like real life, they were able to see if a flood were to happen, if a storm were to happen, how the water comes in, how this berm will protect them and this pump station. So if we didn't have that, I don't know if we would have gotten the community's buy-in, let me say that. And that was necessary in order for our final EIS to be approved. The other issue that was very important that we had to make clear, and we had wonderful renderings of this, is how will the elevation of University Ave, which is leading into Seaside Park, how will that look? The park is important. It's like the crown jewel of our city. So the idea of us coming in and doing any type of construction or changing how the park looks was scary to people. It was a little jarring. And so we were able to give them wonderful visuals and show how even with some of the modifications we have an arborist on our team. We're going to make sure any trees that we disrupt, we're going to make sure we replant them. Any trees that are dying now, we're going to make sure that we replace those as well. And so when they realized how committed we were able to get the community's buy-in, and that it will also be, they'll be able to bike ride, they'll be able to walk. Any elevation that we do, we want to make sure that the park is still accessible. That's important to Bridgeport.
Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. And I think Bobby and Lori, I know you definitely have some things to say here, so please chime in.
Yeah, thanks. And I was just noticing in the chat just some conversations about more rural strategies too. I think just a lot of the themes that we're talking about, we're seeing pretty easily transferable. So in terms of kind of broader rural strategies and community control, we've been working in rural Hawaii on food related work. And there's groups that are doing work on regenerative agriculture who can say, look, we can talk to you about a 62% reduction in type 2 diabetes risk from youth participating in our programs, or we can talk about a 10% increase in high school graduation, but that's not what it's important to us. What's important is a reconnection back to culture and to each other. Those are the outcomes that are important. And so we need to retrain our youth to think in Hawaiian, and we can speak English if we have to. So I think there's a big piece around community control on who gets to define success and defining success in the cultural terms that are important to communities experiencing inequity. I think that's really key. I think the other piece around rural, Laura, you mentioned that just because there's nature all around you doesn't mean it's accessible. And we found this in the Columbia Gorge, where when you put those Medicaid dollars in the hands of community, almost immediately you had investment in Latinx leadership programs, and you had 2 community health workers from the farm worker community elected to the transportation board. And then there was a natural gas bus line connecting farm worker communities into town and jobs and doctors' offices, as well as a bus line that went up to Mount Hood for outdoor recreation. And it was a really simple, low-cost investment in leadership development that happened. So those are the kinds of things when you just trust community and put money into community's hands and you let community define what success looks like, good things start to happen.
Thanks, Bobby. And Lori, we heard from you that the Health Authority has a mission to eliminate health inequity in 10 years. And so that definitely gives all of us in this room a new meaning for what 2030 is. And so just kind of curious, what do you think you need from conservationists to be able to take work at this intersection forward?
That's a really good question. Let me give a couple examples. I think, I guess just to add on to what's been said about community, the first and foremost is there has to be a redistribution of power in turn. And when I say power, that means dollars. Bobby and I put a couple examples of these, the Columbia Gorge Health Council and the Central Oregon Health Council. Pacific Source Health Plan, or the CCO, the Coordinated Care Organization that manages Medicaid, they're committed. They put in a percentage of their profits give it to the health council, and then those health councils, which are locally controlled, decide how those dollars are spent. They provide grants, like the example Bobby gave, to organizations on a wide variety of health topics. So the Columbia Gorge, for example, focuses on physical activity. They focus on some more, social, better social environment, and some other aspects around health and transportation. And so those kinds of, opportunities to invest in social determinants is a place where, conservation can be key. Another area that I would say we have a lot of energy invested is with our, in Oregon, we have 9 federally recognized tribes. So we engage in tribe, in government to government relations with them, and are in the process of developing what's called an Indian managed care entity. And what that means is that the tribes get Medicaid dollars, but they have, again, much more control around, they're starting out with doing some really intensive care coordination for their members. Now that sounds very health-ish, I guess, but that, for example, that allows them to engage in culturally and cultural practices around diabetes prevention, and meeting the community's needs in health. And one, I'll give another quick example, is in the Columbia Gorge, there's a community called Salado Village. It's an unincorporated community. They're not directly part of a tribal land, and they have a railroad track that runs through their community. And the Gorge River is right alongside. And so there's real issues around them if somebody has an emergency, getting emergency vehicles in if the train's running. So there's an opportunity, I think, where land use can work with, the federal government and other organizations to improve that community's health and well-being. So those are some sorts of examples. And I don't want, while I'm giving examples from Oregon, this concept of social determinants of health and investing Medicaid dollars upstream is something that's happening all over the country. So, the Medicaid program in Massachusetts, for example, has a lot of progressive programs. And so I don't want anyone to walk away thinking that, Oregon is completely unique here.
Yeah, and I think to that end, Maggie, it'd be great to hear from you. You mentioned the need for patient capital in this work, and I think it's an interesting story in and of itself that there's a housing fund at the Conservation Law Foundation, and so would just love for you to unpack that a bit more.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I sometimes have to say we do more than conservation and more than law, although we're widely and best known for both of those things. But as I said, our mission really does include healthy and thriving communities, and we can't separate housing and conservation and communities if we're really trying to solve the kind of complex interrelated problems that we've been talking about. And on that note, for example, in Massachusetts, housing and transportation combined are the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions. And housing and transportation constitute, the core infrastructure of the neighborhoods people live in and work through, and and the places that we either thrive or don't. So we really have to think about all these issues together, whether we come at it from an environmental perspective or a housing perspective. From a health standpoint, I appreciate a lot of the comments in the chat about trying to understand and track down how healthcare dollars are allocated in relation to community health needs assessments. What I would say in part about both patient capital and also healthcare finance more broadly is that there are an incredible number of funding streams related to healthcare. And some of those streams are better suited to some uses than others. So certainly community benefit dollars are one that people are familiar with. And in some ways that's been described to me as a sort of an accounting function, because nonprofit hospitals need to demonstrate that they've put at least 5% of their net spend in a given year toward a community benefit purpose. More recently, that has to be aligned with a needs assessment, which is terrific progress, but there are also treasury dollars, there are also insurance reserves that flow through insurance plans. In Massachusetts and Connecticut and potentially other states, there are requirements for hospitals that are completing a capital expansion, a new hospital wing, a new patient tower, to set aside direct funds for other community-based projects. So it's really, there's a whole kind of breadth of resources that flow through health systems, some of which are really philanthropic in nature, some of which are really more traditionally investment focused, either loans or equity products or the like. So I think, what we've learned is it's important to get to know local health systems, but also people within those systems. There are champions in probably every hospital in the country who are thinking about what happens outside the clinic or the hospital walls, and all the things that impact the health of the people they serve and their own workforce. But it takes some work to unpack kind of how to think about the resources available, financial and human, and create the partnerships that are needed to solve problems. And that's not a quick process. It's not a one-stop. It really is, I think, as other panelists have alluded to, a longer process of building partnerships and understanding where there's an alignment between kind of needs and resources and what people bring to the table. And that's certainly been our experience with the fund. So it's incredibly important. Healthcare can be a key partner. They have access to a lot of resources, but it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Thanks so much, Maggie. And one of the things we saw in the chat is that audience members were resonating with the phrase activating civic muscle. And so as we go upstream, just curious to understand from each of y'all's perspectives, what are some of the enabling or disabling conditions at the policy level, and how can the conservation community show up in those spaces?
So I think, some of the things for me, and I'll put in chat a link to a resource that just launched today from Build Healthy Places Network, that are a number of policy actions around belonging and civic muscle. But it's everything from kind of town master planning to making sure that like health equity is a pillar, just like open space is a pillar or transportation is a pillar around that. I think kind of town-wide, citywide, county-wide racial equity policies that go all the way from how decision-making is made all the way to the minutia of procurement is really important. Looking at participatory budgeting and how public resources and other resources are allocated are all important. But there's only so much that you can do with policy. Belonging in civic muscle is a lot about culture change and just being in authentic relationship with people. And so just not shortchanging that it's just going to be hard work to hang out with people that are different from you. And that's just what it's going to be. You can do policy, but you got to do the work too.
Yeah, I want to add on to that with a couple things come to mind. One is, I think as people who work in government like me, it's pretty easy to sit in a room and design things without checking with community, and it takes a lot longer. And so and lots of times there's pressure around funding or politics or legislation and that sort of thing. So planning ahead on how you're going to engage community and not just go ask them some questions and then come back and build your project, but to have them involved from the ground up and really have a voice. And that voice also means, some say about how dollars are spent. Those are the key things, but it is really thinking about how we work in our structures in a different way as opposed to just generating policy. So those are some of my ideas.
And we're just coming up on time here, but I think that's exactly the perfect point to end on. And just want to thank all of our panelists here for making a very exciting presentation and discussion. There'll definitely be some more space to continue to talk about this shortly. But I think, just to kind of reference, it seems to me when you have a bunch of conservationists in New England that there are two things that are guaranteed in a room. It's kind of flannel and science, at least that I see from my perspective. And just kind of going with the science side of things, there's the in physics, the observer effect, and that just knowing about the relationship changes, knowing about something changes your relationship to it. And I think, you know, definitely here, and I suppose, you know, one of the more high level conversation that we've been having, I think that it'll serve to change a lot for folks. So with that, just want to reference these folks again, and that, you know, as Hadley mentioned in the earlier panel, definitely feel free to call on them. You don't need the expertise, you just need to reach out, and that the expertise is elsewhere and distributed, and we need to find different ways of understanding that, especially in community. So with that, I will gladly turn it back over to our hosts, Spencer and Lee. Thanks so much, y'all.
Lee, are you with us here?
I'm with you.
All right.
I don't know how to spot myself, but
if someone could, there we go. Go ahead, Lee, you're up.
all right, let me just flip over here. So again, as with other sessions, we do, it should, let's see, when have you put the link for the reflection and insight form into the chat box? Hopefully you're all very well habituated at this point with our surveys at the end, our reflection questions. And really, Spencer, that's just my role, is to plug the quick question here as folks are transitioning into the breakout groups. So
Sure.
I'm going to pivot right back to you.
All right, great. Yeah, well, thank you, Sean, and all of our speakers in that last panel. That was really wonderful, and I want to think, and I think it's true that was a departure from what we see at many traditional conservation conferences, and we tried really hard, and I think it just came through loud and clear how these connections are really important for bringing this whole community forward in a lot of the ways. And these connections between health and housing and open spaces, we can't ignore those. And I think Maggie Super Church used this phrase that just really hits it home for me, that the places we either thrive or don't. And that was just like a really stark way for me. So thank you for that, Maggie, of saying like, that's what it's about. While we're protecting nature and biodiversity, it's also very much about these places that we all live in. We either are going to thrive or we aren't. And that is, we have the ability to change those. So thank you for that inspiration, all of you. We're going to transition to small group discussions in a minute. And I know this is the point at online meetings where it's really easy to snake away and go do something else or move on to some other meeting you have. But I implore you, Lee and I together implore you to stick with us, because what's going to happen in these sessions is we're going to have a whole host of conservation finance leaders from around the region and the country that are going to lead you in some small discussions. We're going to use the results of those discussions and those insights you all provide to really develop some of the collaborations and planning going forward. And we need all of you to contribute and have your voice heard in that. So that's going to last until 12:40. And then Lee and I are going to come back and try to lead a little bit of a discussion about what some of these collaborations could look like. And Lee's going to offer some of her recap points of the day. So I really encourage you to stick with us. Thank you so much to the last panel. And when I believe you're going to introduce how we get over to the other rooms.
One thing that we wanted to do in starting this wrap up was to pose a question to everyone, all 100 of you, in the chat. And I think there might also be an accompanying Google Doc, but it may just be in the chat. What will it take to make some of the ideas that we've all heard and shared today more widespread across New England? And I think principally from our interest area, does that capacity exist? Are the partners and collaborations in place already, or do they need to be seeded and developed? It's a wordy one. Let me just go ahead and drop that into chat, lest you didn't follow along with my talking bits. And so I'll just invite you all, as I'm doing a quick recap of just some salient points I heard today, to please share your own and respond to this prompt. We're going to build that in at the end. You won't be surprised to learn. So I'm going to do my best to recap panel by panel some of the salient points we heard, just to enshrine some of those learnings and ahas. I'll beg your forgiveness on not having had a lot of time to refine these, but to capture them as we go. So jumping in on clean water investments, what I heard was that understanding the aligned interests of entities like water utilities is super important, that we need to understand the nuance and implications around the legal structures of conservation easements, for example. Sometimes a utility might need an ownership interest. We need to be sensitive and aware of the technicalities there. What I heard on the SRF front is something that I've known a little: statute change. You know, in order to really increase the type of SRF applications, we need to think about statute change. We need to think about then generating projects and putting them together, having that pipeline cooked up. I think the comment was 3 years of pipeline in advance, and really having the need for the partnership of the land conservation community to populate that pipeline. The question on how we start approaching water partnerships with the private sector. What I heard loud and clear was that this work is happening where entrepreneurial people like David, Celia, and others in the watershed are getting ahead of existing constructs to come together and move beyond where we are. There is no existing blueprint. That's where we are. So thinking about what that means and what that implies, one aspect of what would help in the absence of blueprints is intermediation. Can intermediation help different groups to come together around a business challenge? And because we're still building the business case, is there a way to take this wild, wild west, or as it was couched, the wild northeast, perhaps, and move it more from the bleeding edge to at least the cutting edge? I think, you know, we would be making great strides if we were moving from the bleeding edge to the cutting edge. We heard that there's a lot of anxiety on the part of traditional conservation finance community, traditional conservation community around models that rely on quantification, on contracts, and on markets. Perhaps we're all a little too resistant to change or to risk, but we need to expand the pie by tapping new resources, and that requires new levers. Framing just in general is challenging. We need to overcome the inertia of an existing practice. Starting to fund non-traditional programs can take a lot of time. We need new processes, new procedures, and again, back to that statutes issue, that we really need to be thinking on kind of systems capacity and joint interest in change statutes and procedures. A lot of trust building, a lot of relationship building that needs to occur between water utilities and the traditional land trust community, and some pretty significant implications on timing. You have to line up with construction projects if you're going to be thinking about water utility partnerships. You need to think about what the pipeline need is in terms of stacking some of those capital sources. And again, thinking about what our role is in stacking up that pipeline. Lastly, just framing and context setting, community outreach, public education, those can all be good long-term roles for collaboratives like Sebago Clean Waters and other RCPs. And, you know, it sounds like there are some engineering firms or others who would be really good unexpected partners for RCPs, and we should pursue those yesterday. So Spencer, just a quick response from your end on some of the takeaways from the clean water investment recap.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to keep up, Lee, with the ideas that are coming forward in the chat. Some of them are familiar, but many are not. And I think what we're doing right now is actually a key ingredient in this. Is one lesson I heard across all the panels, but particularly in the water panels, that the expertise exists. It's just a matter of linking the people that have the different kinds of expertise, right? So like understanding why a water utility cares about this in the first place and putting it together with the expertise of a finance shop and then putting it together with a state policy that knows how to move those things through the process. Like, that is what matters. It's bringing those people together. We don't all need to be trained up on everything ourselves, but we need to have exposure to these different experts. And so the opportunities and the resources, at least the human resources, are largely there already, but the getting them together is a key part of that. I mean, I think another one is that, and we definitely learned this in the Sebago Clean Waters work a lot, is that the conservation has for so long focused on the supply side of conservation. That is, where is all the stuff we care about and protecting? And that is critical to do. But once we start shifting into the who actually demands this stuff is when we start finding the finance. So, oh, you mean businesses in Portland need clean water? Of course they do. And so then you start finding the people and the unusual partners that are really vested in doing this work, or the water utilities. And so it's a bit of a shift to this sort of demand side conservation rather than supply side conservation is a bit of how I think about it. And I think from there, the finance flows.
Yeah, so much of that boils down to coalition building that needs to be done across water, across healthy people and healthy communities, across natural climate solutions. And, surprise, surprise, that's what we wanted to seed today. But yeah. I do think that's where a lot of this comes from. All right, so on to healthy people and community. No, I skipped over natural climate solutions. So just some salient points, again, my interpretation from what we heard from the panel, the importance of promoting adaptation co-benefits and not pitting mitigation and adaptations against each other. I really liked, I think this was posted in the chat, especially for the same and too small pool of funding. It seemed like our speakers all had a common theme around improving the science, policy, and practice. We heard the great potential of technology, the ability to nest remote sensing, satellite, and machine learning capabilities and other technology into our project approaches, whether for reduced transaction costs or greater project monitoring and quantification, all as a way to really bolster the pace and scale of how we're able to interact with natural climate solutions. I really appreciate something Karen shared, Amazon's and also approach. I take from that it's quite similar to the rules of improv, the yes and approach to natural climate solutions. So we do need all hands on deck. We can't stop at our own individual efforts on our own organizational boundaries. I appreciate that Amazon is interested in looking beyond their value chain as where they're placing investments and really seeding some change. Agility. It's a fast and evolving space. So if we think of ourselves as, I don't want to be crass and compare us to dogs in the training ring, but we really all benefit from our own agility training together and with partners. I appreciated the reference to mass timber and really thinking not just about natural climate in kind of preserved forest lands, so much as also thinking about the built environment, the life cycle of materials, the impact that material sourcing has on landscapes as part of, considering storage potential from the built environment and sequestering carbon within literal buildings. And then the emphasis on large scale corporate investment. I appreciated the comment about how this was leaving degraded landscapes and cities behind, and really some of the inequities that come from that, as it does have an impact on kind of the underlying value of the land base and other things. So Spencer, obviously not comprehensive in the recap, but just care to comment on the natural climate solutions takeaways.
Yeah, I think just 2 quick points, because we want to get into the end here of the last panel. But for me, the thing that really hit home in the natural climate panel is the quick evolution of things. Don't wait around to figure out what's perfect. Just get going and try it out, whether you're someone that wants to do a carbon project or whether you're developing a new protocol, because several of the speakers pointed out how rapidly this evolution has occurred in the last 10 years. I remember when Down East Lakes Land Trust did the first improved forest management carbon project in the country. That feels like yesterday. And now look at where we are. And I just think that's remarkable. And everyone's wondering about what happens if there's national cap and trade or if there's national tax and dividend policy. Everything that's happening now will have created the underpinnings for those policies. The carbon brokers that are there now will be looked to for their guidance. And so everything that's being learned right now will be relied on, even if the policies themselves evolve. So just jump right in and get started on that front, that we have no time to lose, frankly, on the climate front. The last point is that the conservation community needs to work hard to be relevant and to stay relevant, I think, within this arena, because this is a global society-wide problem that everyone is paying attention to. This is not a niche environmental issue. And for the conservation community to stay relevant and get their piece of the pie, so to speak, I think we need to really work hard to take leadership out there in the media, in the policy arena, and let the world know what the conservation community has to offer, back to that basic idea we talked about earlier of photosynthesis. So that's my recap there.
Thanks, Spencer. And we're going to just roll right into the healthy people and healthy communities. I'll pare my comments down to the extent I can edit myself while speaking here. I found the panel to be inspiring as much as the work is incredibly daunting in what it requires of us to expand the boundaries of where we think our work lies and who we engage with and how. So I thought it was just elegantly and beautifully expansive on that front, investing upstream in parks, green space, housing, healthcare, green infrastructure, climate resilience. We have to bring it all together to look at the holistic healthcare investments and engagement, to look at holistic housing and healthy neighborhood investments, coupled with community ownership. So all of us, should really kind of sit with some of that awareness. Let's see, can we do a mute all for non-speakers here? So we did get a glimpse into what it would take to push the agenda for health in the outdoors, systems thinking. We heard an example where a response to climate-induced community flooding is stimulating development of new housing and infrastructure, just incredible. And then just a couple top-line ahas or takeaways. Ownership of change is connected to better health and better outcomes. Community ownership and trust is built, not bought. That path has to be driven by co-creation. Just because nature is all around you doesn't mean it's accessible. And so we need to really think about who is driving the decisions of where those investments are placed, whether funding or financial. A lot was said and spoken to in an eloquent way on the redistribution of power. And by power, we mean money, dollars. So some really great examples of health councils driving locally controlled decisions on where and how dollars are spent. And let's see, I have a whole bunch more, but I'll just wrap it up with understanding that all of this really requires culture change too.
Yeah, Lee, that's great. Thank you. And you and I are going to have a chance to sort of consolidate some of these notes that we've taken and some of the comments and provide resources, including the video. We have a lot of questions about the video. And so we will be sharing all of that probably within 1 to 2 weeks. We'll compile all this information, resources from speakers. One point I wanted to make about the last panel is that this is also some of the most inspiring work that's going on from my perspective too. And you and I, Lee, both have collaborated with Brad Gentry in the Center for Business and the Environment. And there, in addition to Yale and all the groups we heard this morning, there are a lot of groups around the country trying to tackle this issue. And I think in our region, it's going to take a really big concerted effort to bring all the right voices together, because this is not something the conservation community is going to figure out on its own. And every time someone asked a question, Bobby or one of the other speakers was right there in the chat to be able to give a specific example. Maggie did this a bunch too. Like, there are things happening around the country, and our job is to stitch them together for this community, Lee. And so I'm excited about launching some sort of collaboration together. We've both had some conversations with some regional funders that have some interest in this area. And I think there's a real opportunity for some funders, some other foundations to come together in a peer way and make some of these connections and make some sort of seed money available. So we're excited to launch those kinds of collaborations with you, of course, Lee, but also with our other partners around the region. So that's one real take home for me today. And I hope people will follow up with us with specific ideas for how to do that, either personally by email, but also in the Google Form survey that we're gonna close with in just a minute.
Speaking of, do we want to launch that survey?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, so one last request from us in terms of a survey response. There's been a lot of really valuable insight shared through chat and obviously collected through these responses. So we'll beg for a little time to sift through it, but we really appreciate the contributions. So Gwen just put into the chat box that link. Please go ahead and take a stab at it.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. And with that, I guess just a couple of final words. And again, a note of thanks to our entire team behind the scenes today. It has been really just brilliant operations by the team, and I want to thank all of them. I see some of them sort of turn their video back on now, and I appreciate that. And Lee, your partnership in this has been terrific, as always. And like we said at the beginning, this is really intended to be a reinvigoration of conversations and some more frequent dialogue on these various topics. And what format that looks like, I think we're not sure yet whether we carve it up by topic or region or not, but I'm excited for that. I want to thank all of you for coming today and being with us. Also, this work really builds on the Regional Conservation Partnership Gathering and the webinars we hosted in the fall. And this is going to take us right into this next year of the gathering that Highstead hosts every year that we're really excited about to bring some of these ideas to the fore yet again. And for me, it was, I think one of the key successes we were most interested in was bringing in some different organizations that might not come to land trust type conferences. And that happened pretty well today. And I was excited about that. And we all need to be doing more of that. So Lee, thank you so much. It's fun as always to hang out with you and hear your thoughts. And thanks again to our audience.
Absolutely, Spencer. The Highstead team just deserves a standing round of applause as you're all kind of getting up from your computers in this Zoom. I hope that it's been a valuable time together. I know from our perspective, it has been an invaluable time together, especially when we can't come together in person. So appreciate the ability to really see these future collaborations with you all today. Thanks for the time. Thanks, Highstead, for making it possible and providing the leadership and the follow through to execute.
Great. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. It was great to see you all.